This podcast is brought to you by CDkeyoffer.com. Use offer code BrokenSilicon to save 25% on all Microsoft software. And then it is also brought to you by JLC PCB. Get a $10 coupon for Flex PCBs at the link in the description. And then it is also brought to you by Minis Forum BD 795 series motherboards. You can check out these incredibly powerful and incredibly reasonably priced motherboards through the link in the description. We'll talk about these sponsors more later. But for now, let's just get on with the show. Welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and I have to say today's guest probably needs absolutely no introduction for 99% of the people listening. He's been on many times before. I have to imagine the overwhelming majority of the fans of Moore's Law said listen to this person's channels. But please, just for completionist's sake, who are you? What do you do? And I think a fun aside question to this would be, what role do you see Hardware Unboxed playing most importantly in the Techtuber and PC gaming community spaces?
Yeah. Hey, good to be back. It's Tim here from Hardware Unboxed. I just think that we really do in-depth hardware testing. That's really what we're known for. That's really what we try and get into the most. So, yeah, what role do we play? I guess providing the information that the audience and viewers want for buying PC hardware, really.
Yeah, and I have to say, and I notice this on Hardware Unboxed more and more and more as time goes on, and honestly, any Techtuber channel that continues to do well, frankly, is I wouldn't say it's less about the data and the testing, but more as time goes on. Don't you find it's becoming impossible to not also have to look at the things going on around launches, whether it has to do with supply, how they're being marketed in terms of performance? It's becoming impossible to escape that you need to do, I don't know how to put it, like need to do your homework on everything else around a launch. You can't just say the data, because if you can even buy it, and how we even define performance becomes much more up for debate over time.
Yeah, I mean, that's true with all the features and stuff coming out as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think all of that is still grounded in giving people the information that they need to make buying decisions. Like if you can't buy a GPU, then we need to look into what are the current prices that people are paying, how much availability there is, and when someone might be able to buy it. Because obviously when there's low supply, people want to go out and spend more than they should. So if we can give some information, context around that, then that helps people buy products. Same with the feature sort of things. You need to look into those because those are things that are advertised. And then obviously on top of that, they're actually things people might want to use. So yeah, there's lots of things these days. It's not just about the benchmark charts anymore, as much as maybe we'd like that to be the case.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess it all just goes back to the whole, we're trying to provide the data for people, and we give opinions and those sorts of things as well. But at the end of the day, hopefully people can take everything that we say and come to their own conclusions.
Yeah. Now, I think this is an interesting question here from jchrist08. He says, with SteamOS nearing a full release, how much of a headache will that add to testing new hardware? And that's something because it's already annoying, right, to test Windows 10 versus 11. But what if SteamOS really does take off as like a true desktop operating system?
Oh, I think that would be great. I'm not the biggest fan of Microsoft. I think they've been doing a lot to harm Windows over the last couple of years. So, I mean, they've added a few features here and there, but obviously Windows 11's been a bit of a mess with the performance things, as you alluded to. So SteamOS would be great for that, providing actual competition to Windows. I think with the testing side of things, though, it's really only about the testing tools, like what's the quality of all the benchmarking software and things that we use. Is that going to be working well on SteamOS? So provided those tools are available, there shouldn't really be too many issues testing like SteamOS versus Windows. Again, like if SteamOS is just purely locked to Steam games, then that might affect the testing of games that aren't available on Steam. I know I own a Steam Deck, so you can install other launchers on there to run your other games. It's a bit of a pain compared to the just Steam launcher sort of thing. But so those are all the sort of challenges I'd be thinking about. But really, I think it'd be really interesting for people. It's kind of just a monopoly. Everyone just uses Windows
Yeah.
by default. But people have shown over the years that Linux gaming can perform better in some situations. It's come a long way. So I think the market is ready for something like SteamOS. I think it'd actually be quite successful if it launched for desktop users. That I'd probably have to think about dual booting again, that sort of thing. But yeah, I'm ready for it at least. I think it'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't be more excited for that because of the lack of competition in gaming operating systems. It just feels like every few years we just have to like put up with something stupid Microsoft does. I mean, I remember games for Windows Live where they tried to turn gaming PCs into an Xbox, and then the Fallout 3 devs had to like rip it out of the game and break it for a year just to get it to keep working, because then they got rid of games for Windows Live, and like they just killed Skype as well. Like there's all these things where it's like, oh, now we're doing this thing. Oh, now we're not. And then we just have to deal with it. I would think competition there would really help. It kind of sounds like to me like it could be a headache to have to test more than one or two operating systems, but because of how excited you are for that competition, who cares? We're excited to see if it does well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the early days, our main benchmarking and reviews and things would still be on Windows because that's what most people would be using. But certainly for like additional content here and there, to sort of look at how things compare on SteamOS is sort of how we'd approach it for the early parts. But that all hinges on, of course, them actually releasing it and doing those sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, the Microsoft Store, just for like buying games, playing games out of it, is just so much worse than Steam. And the fact
Do you
that
remember when you couldn't even play games like full screen for like 2 years when they put them on the
oh,
Microsoft Store like 5 years ago or something?
yeah, or installing them to like a second SSD was very difficult. It would just break half the
Because
time.
no
So
one would ever think to do that.
I know it's crazy. So they're so far behind with that sort of thing that you'd have to think that maybe they need to kick up the ass a bit for this sort of thing, like
Hmm.
get it into gear, actually make the gaming experience on Windows better. But they're too busy with all that AI stuff, so they're not going to do that.
Hugo Ander Kiwi writes in and says, since the average FPS and even 1% lows can be lacking for quantifying the smoothness of the frame rate, have you considered including 0.1% lows in your testing methodology? Also, what do you think about having a measure across different GPUs to measure frame time stability? Like this would highlight discrepancies between present and past GPUs in terms of their ability to deliver fluid gameplay. I understand that there are difficulties and run-to-run variances for this, but there is no one else doing it. So this could be an interesting opportunity for you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think with all these newer metrics, not the not the 1.1% lows are a new metric, right? It's been around for a while. Whenever we've looked into them, it's sort of like, are they showing something that the
Mm.
1% lows don't show? And so I find it quite rare that 1% lows don't show stuttering or a lack of frame time smoothness in games. It's not just about the frame rate that it's showing. Like it doesn't have to be 20 FPS or 30 FPS versus 100 FPS for average FPS to see stuttering in games. So long as the gap between the average and the 1% lows is large, generally that indicates some sort of instability, especially if you're looking at relative to other GPUs. So if you've got a chart, it's got all your different GPUs, and there's one that is particularly bad with 1% lows, that tends to indicate that that GPU has stability problems or a lack of consistency. And that tends to be pretty reliable. Like what we've seen across
Hmm.
the years is that tends to show all the situations. And if you put in 0.1% lows, it's just a lower frame rate version of what the 1% lows would show. So if the 0.1% lows are really bad, then the 1% lows are probably going to suffer as well. So when we're looking into these sorts of things, like what's a new metric we can use, is that capturing situations that like aren't being shown for 1% lows, but might be shown for a new metric. And so things like, frame time variance between frames, those sorts of things are interesting, but, we have to weigh up things like how difficult is it to explain what the metric is to people? How much is it actually showing? And then, the question brings up the run to run variance thing, which is pretty important because
Hmm.
a single run of a benchmark is not necessarily going to be indicative of what you're always going to get in that game. And so, how does something like frame time variability go between runs? Like, if you're averaging the output of that between the runs, is that actually providing useful information? So
Yeah,
yeah, I
well, and
mean,
especially in 0.1% lows, right? I know with a lot of benchmarks, like ones that come to mind was the Metro games. Like maybe the first time you run a benchmark run, for some reason there's hitching, and then you have to come to the conclusion, well, do we remove the 0.1% low thing that was in every
yeah.
first run, or do we include it and hope it averages out? Even though on this one GPU, it was twice as bad in the first run, but wasn't bad in later runs.
I think we usually remove, there are definitely games we know have issues benchmarking it on the first. And there's even a couple of games where, run 1, 2, 3 can be bad. So then you need to average it over 6 or remove the first couple. So we tend to do that just because, if you're playing a game for hours, generally if that hitching is only within the first minute or a couple of minutes of gameplay, then it's not really relevant for people playing games for a long period of time. So we tend to adjust for that sort of thing. But yeah, certainly like in games where there can be those issues that resolve itself over time, or you load in the assets for one area, then you go revisit that same
Hmm.
area and it's kind of already loaded, so you don't get as many issues. And then Unreal Engine 5 and other engines have issues with loading sections, the whole shader compilation on the fly sort of thing. So how do you sort of measure that? If you do like a 3-run average, you can get the reverse issue where you're averaging something that's being already loaded and you're repeating it, but in actual gameplay, you'll only be, for example, transitioning between those two areas once, in which
Hmm.
case then the hitching sort of becomes an issue. So yeah, I hope that's something they'll solve in the engine rather than us having to provide in charts. But we're also concerned about things like how cluttered charts are, how easy they are to
Right.
read, the sort of
Because if people
presentation of the
don't bother
data.
to read the chart, what was the point in all of the data clogging up the chart, right?
Yeah, and it becomes really difficult to get that information at a glance. I think in our charts, with having just the two metrics, you can pretty easily see, large average FPS, lower 1% lows. Visually, that's sort of easy to look for. But I mean, whenever these companies come out with AMD, Intel, Nvidia, they've always got their new metrics that they want to present.
Yeah.
They're always
When it
interesting.
most benefits them, always.
Well, yes, that's always the case. Yeah, I mean, those things are interesting. It's just a matter of like how useful it is for people, and yeah, we'll keep exploring that sort of thing. Especially as we're starting to see more of these instances of games where, as I mentioned, sort of the Unreal Engine 5 loading between sections thing, where it seems to be a problem that hasn't been solved. So we'll keep an eye on that.
So, and this is a random thought that just came to mind here. Like, this was years ago when I actually did this, but I like went back and retested a Fermi GTX 580 3 GB, a 660 OEM, which is almost a 660 Ti, 3 GB, and then compare that to, and I've noticed this throughout the years that like I remember when RDNA 1 came out, way better frame times than Vega, which had substantially better frame times than GCN. And over time, and then like Fermi, when I tested, I was like, whoa, 60 frames per second with something from 2010 does not feel like 60 frames per second with an architecture now. I wonder how much, like, because there's, this is a time in history where, because of how inflated GPU prices have gotten relative to just 5 years ago, even, there's a lot of people I still see, like, I still got my 1080 Ti, I've still got my RX 580. Like, how do you think there needs to be somewhat communicated, though, to people that the difference in smoothness between a modern GPU architecture, at least I've found, dwarfs what the same frame rate feels like with something even 5 years ago. Like, and how do you think that kind of could play into? I mean, I think maybe they've fixed the frame times for now, unless a bad generation comes out. But I wonder how you feel about that too, like communicating like, right now, this frame rate feels different than it did 5 years ago. And even things like Poppin and how they handle color compression can make more modern cards look less bad, even though on paper it should be the same performance.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether any of that is directly related to the GPUs or other things
Or
going
like
on.
drivers just falling out.
It's not something I've looked into, but it also could be from just the quality of games themselves. Like latency is obviously a
Sure.
big thing, and latency at 60 FPS can be very different between games. And these days, you're seeing a lot more games fixing their latency, introducing things like NVIDIA Reflex, for example, or just doing Reflex themselves, which can drastically improve the latency and the feel of a game at the same sort of frame rate. So I guess if you're going back and comparing games that you would have been playing 10 years ago to more modern games, I don't know whether you meant testing the exact same game or
I
testing.
did,
Yeah,
because obviously I can't test I don't know what's a Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition on a 580. Although didn't they? No, they didn't add. They added DirectX 12 support to it though, so I could test. And this was a couple years ago, like Strange Brigade and Strange Brigade, somewhat recent game, did not feel the same on a GTX 580, even though it was kind of getting the same frame rate as a 660. 660 felt better, and everything after that felt light years better at the same frame rate.
Yeah, I mean, that could possibly be, something that would show up in 1% lows and that sort of thing. So, yeah, that would certainly be interesting to have a look at. But I think there's all sorts of things that have been improving, gaming. You mentioned things like pop-in, that can be solved by just having better CPUs, better VRAM in games to load assets better and faster. And, obviously CPU performance is becoming, as I mentioned, sort of a bigger issue, something that, old games could slaughter the CPU at times. These days, if
Yeah,
you're running it
still.
on the same GPU but on a much more modern CPU, you're going to get that benefit from running it on a fast CPU. So there's lots of different things there comparing sort of the old to the new.
Thalo215 writes in and says, "Hi, Tom and Tim. What was your reaction, Tim, when Steve did a recent review from his roof?" And I left this question in too because I am curious, like if this was something you guys had talked about. Like, I'm sure eventually we're just going to have to do this from my roof or something. Or was this like actually an impromptu thing? Like how annoying it was reviewing this graphics card in the moment.
I think we talked about it a couple of days ahead of time that maybe we would do the roof thing. It just seemed to become something on our channel, I guess, where people were realizing that Steve would stand up and be a bit more annoyed about products that were bad and would sit down more when products were better. That was never something that we'd really planned or noticed, that sort of thing, but people started to notice. So we kind of ran with it. And I think he did a review for at least part of it standing on a chair. And then Steve was always talking about this idea of doing it on, somewhere higher than that, like on the roof. And I don't think we were really going to do it. But then our video editor, Balin, I think was very keen to try figure out how to do it. And sort of, once the data came in, you sort of realize, this GPU isn't very good. Then, putting a bit of fun into it, doing some stuff on the roof, I guess it kind of made sense. So I think it worked well.
If the RTX 6070 has 12 gigabytes of RAM, are we thinking of going up a cell phone tower perhaps? Or what do you think would have to come next?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe a hot air balloon. You could probably film it in there.
Oh,
I know
that'd be fun.
hot air balloons are quite dangerous, so maybe we'd have to get some insurance for that. But yeah, so it's maybe something like that. But honestly, if they do that again, that would just be crazy. So hopefully we don't. We can go back down. We can start getting inside the house and then sitting at the desk there, maybe in some sort of relaxing recliner sort of setup. So
just laying on the floor for one
that'd
of the
be
reviews,
nice.
perhaps.
Yeah, I think so.
Planet AI Max Plus Pro 9 writes in and says, "Hi, Tim. In a die shrink from January 2024, Tom and Dan discussed how hard it is for some reviewers to properly quantify the need to have competent VRAM for a GPU. However, not Hardware Unboxed, at least recently, in your 5070 review, it was heavily focused on this. So how did producing that video push this issue for the Hardware Unboxed team personally? And what ideas do you have for how you or other reviewers should focus on the importance of having enough VRAM going forward?"
Yeah, I mean, we've been focusing on VRAM for a while, and I think that comes from some of the testing that we did from the 30 series to now, where it kind of surprised us a bit how quickly VRAM requirements increased in games. It was a situation where there was sort of some warning signs in the 30 series that there would be some games that may struggle on 8 gigabyte GPUs, but we sort of thought maybe those would just be edge cases for a while, and you only see a couple of games that required more than that. But I think as we've moved more into having titles that are exclusive to the latest console generation, so PS5, Xbox not running on the previous gen consoles, that's really accelerated the VRAM requirements for gaming. And so that's something that we're really focused on at the moment. And when it comes to things like reviews and those sorts of things, how should we focus on the importance of that? The issues with VRAM come in many different forms. There's not just performance loss, which can happen in some titles where games just become totally unplayable, but there's also image quality issues where games will just dump textures or have different levels of pop-in. We've seen plenty of examples of that. Like, I know Steve always brings up Halo Infinite as a game where textures get dumped. A game like Star Wars Outlaws, it can change the distance to which you see high quality textures. So if you have more VRAM, you see a better quality texture from a lot more of the surfaces around the game at greater distances. And then there's still games today like, you start to see Indiana Jones with some of the more
Mm.
high quality settings that it just does not work very well on those low end GPUs with 8 gigabytes of memory. And so, we're starting to see plenty of examples of this, and we don't want people to be caught out with these sorts of problems where, previously, if we've been talking about, you start to see some issues, some games with 8 gigabytes of GPUs being a problem, and then people actually are getting caught out within that generation, within the reasonable lifespan of that card. People that bought like 3070s, 3070 Ti's, quite expensive GPUs, getting caught out because the games that they want to play a couple of years later, they're having to dial down settings, which on that class of GPU, I don't think is really acceptable. And so it's sort of trying to warn people a bit more. Like, of course, there are games today that still will run fine on 8 gigabyte GPUs. But I personally feel, and Steve feels the same, that when you're talking about $500 plus graphics cards, and we've even said, $300 plus, $200 plus for 8
I
gig.
agree.
But now, $500, we're getting 12 gig, really it should be 16. That's a lot of money to spend on a gaming product, even though it's mid-range, so to speak, in terms of you look at the lineup, it's still a lot of money to spend. And I think that should be giving you the ultra settings 1440p experience at minimum. And often today, you're not able to achieve that. Definitely with 8 gigabytes, and 12 gigabytes is kind of a will it, won't it be good enough for the next few years of gaming, especially because GPUs that we're talking about today will have to survive a new console generation.
Yeah.
Like we're talking, if you're using a 5070 for 5 years, definitely the PS6 will be released during that time. Who knows what the memory requirements, the memory improvements will be for that sort of generation, and that will cause more VRAM issues. So, yeah, we've been really looking into it. We've been trying to, see the games where VRAM's been an issue for gaming. Look at the settings where it's problematic, and I think we've tried to keep it all very reasonable. Like we don't often talk about, we're not talking about 4K, crazy, ultra, super max, everything ray tracing settings. We're always grounding it in settings, configurations where it should be playable or would be playable had there been more VRAM. So things like 4060 Ti 8 versus 16 gigabyte, lots of situations where the 16 gig card delivers very playable frame rates, the 8 gig card doesn't. And so when you've got those examples, you can really talk about this in a way where it makes sense for people and is something that you might actually run into.
Yeah, I have to ask too, like, do you think that it's worse the 5070 has 12 gigabytes than it was the 3070 had 8 gigabytes? Because personally, it feels worse, even though to me, I thought that it was pretty obvious the 3070 would run into issues. You already had games that were already 1 or 2 years old struggling in 4K with even high settings. The infamous one I keep bringing up is Resident Evil 2 remake. And now I feel like it's quite different because 1440p is starting to kind of feel like how 1080p did to me like 5 or 10 years ago. And we're seeing even 1440p, not ultra, maybe not even high, but even medium in some releases, have at least deficiencies in textures on 12 gigabytes. I don't know. I guess I need to stop talking. Like, do you feel like this is worse than 8 gigabytes 5 years ago? It's already been 5 years too, by the way.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that it comes down to sort of the context around the rest of the releases and the progress that we've had. So I think 12 gigabytes, it's probably in a similar position in terms of the games that, the amount of games that would struggle on a 12 gig card, the projections for the future, probably pretty similar between 8 gig back then and 12 gig now. But I think it's just the lack of progress that we've seen that makes the 5070 so much worse. Like we've come from 8 gigabytes, that was the 1070 back in nearly 10 years ago, right?
And or so, 480 for $230.
Yeah, that's right. And so we've gone now nearly 8 years since then, around that from memory, 8 or 9 years. And they've only been able to add an extra 4 gigabytes of memory to the 70 class while also charging a lot more for that GPU. And so, is that acceptable? I think if you went back to a 3070, 8 gigabytes was it's been a couple of generations of having 8 gig. But, the context around everything was probably in a bit better of a position, especially because, the 3080 had 10 gigabytes and then the 3080 Ti had 12 gigabytes. So it didn't feel like you were cutting down that much. Whereas I feel like with the current generation where you've got, the
32 gigabytes at the top, triple the RAM. It's outrageously more.
So it's a lot more. that plays into it. The lack of progress, just the general feeling of surely by now we should be having more VRAM on these cards. And so I think that affects it a lot, and that makes it feel a lot worse to have a 5070 with 12 gigabytes of memory. And maybe they could get away with 12 gig on lower end cards, but certainly in that price class, the fact that you have to spend 750 theoretical dollars if you could buy it for a 5070 Ti to get 16 gig is just not sufficient anymore in this era. You should be getting more. So yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, and it's interesting too now, because when I speak to developers, they're starting to get more and more annoyed because first they'll target like a PS5, which has availability for more RAM for the image quality it's going to give you. They're kind of moving away from the Xbox Series S, but then the Xbox Series X also has 16 gigabytes of RAM. And then you have APUs coming out. Like I got a Strix system here, and it has 64 gigabytes of DDR5 in it. Like it can throw 32, 48 gigs of RAM at a GPU that's, a little weaker than a 3050. So developers are going, okay, so on the one hand, the consoles don't have this issue. On the other hand, high end doesn't have this issue. And on the other hand, we've got these APUs, and to a degree from Intel as well, with like Arrow Lake kind of being like 365 performance, AI9 HX 365 performance. It's like, but none of those have a VRAM issue. So like all of the laptops don't have a VRAM issue, all the high end and all of the console. Like, why should we optimize our game for this one card in the middle of the lineup that just came out? And that wasn't as much of the thing in the past, where iGPUs were a lot weaker.
Yeah, I mean, I feel for developers having to deal with this problem, and it's even something that Nvidia acknowledges that all the features that they develop require more VRAM. So I think they've just pushed out, what is it? Their AI system was called like G Assist or something. It's limited to 12 gigabyte plus graphics cards. Every time we've talked to them about that AI stuff that they're working on, it's always the limitation is VRAM, not the tensor cores. And so you've got that. So NVIDIA themselves, they're developing features they know and probably not going to run on these low VRAM cards. You've got developers who are obviously having to struggle with this across trying to develop for a wide variety of systems. PC gaming is becoming more popular, so people are getting into it, buying games on PC. Then, people just crank it up to ultra, right? Like everyone does that, and then you get complaints. You get negative reviews on Steam or whatever because they're running it on some card with not enough VRAM. That's why they're getting stuttering issues running it on ultra or high settings or whatever. So that's a problem, and the problem is easily solved. This is not something where we have to come up with some complex solution, complex situation. The solution is just giving more VRAM on GPUs. And I think NVIDIA's tried the upsell angle. They're trying to get you to spend much more money on a graphics card because everyone knows VRAM's an issue now. It's not something that was hidden away. It's widely accepted that 8 gigabytes is not sufficient. Gamers with 8 gig cards know this, so they're not going to be willing to spend that again on a new model, and they're just trying to get you to spend $700 plus on their highest tier cards. But then the issue that they've got is, they're trying to convince people to spend money on these cards, just spend money to get their exclusive features that they spend all this money developing. But how do you convince someone to spend that money? They're going to have to start developing games to use these features, more games with high quality textures and that sort of thing. They need games to look better so that gamers are incentivized to upgrade. Because if current games look similar to what they're currently playing, there's no real incentive to get better visuals because that's just not available in games. And why would you upgrade? So they're kind of stuck in this hard place. They want you to spend more, but are they justifying spending more? Are game developers able to put in the features that would mean you should be upgrading? Because theoretically they could be putting in much higher quality textures. The cards could do more ray tracing things. New innovative AI stuff could be integrated into games. But if all of that requires cards that don't exist in the mid range, they're not going to be able to do that sort of thing. And so it's kind of that chicken and egg situation. And so I think that's going to be a real struggle as you've got these sort of low VRAM models that just aren't sufficient. So everything is brought up by having better mid-range entry-level cards. And if that happens, then game developers will be able to do all those things that they want to do and not just have to sacrifice or cut down those sort of features. We've seen similar things with CPU performance in the past too. CPUs haven't been fast enough. gamers haven't had access to that sort of thing. So CPU side features have had to sort of wait around until we've had better hardware to cope with it.
Jessie is excited that it's finally spring. She's excited to run around and jump in the yard. And you know what? I think this sponsor here will also make you jump for joy, and that is CDkeyoffer.com. CDkeyoffer.com is a long-term sponsor of Moore's Law Z that provides something I think the PC gaming community just needs, and that's reasonable pricing on Microsoft software. But they have other things too. They have games and other products that you can check out. And the reason we've worked with them so long is they are good to us, and they've been good to the community for pretty much the entire life of Moore's Law is Dead. And so I recommend you support someone that supports this channel. And you know what? If you want to, make sure you use offer code BrokenSilicon to save 25% on all Microsoft software, and Die Shrink to save 3% on everything else on the website. Again, using those offer codes helps the channel, and it also helps you save money on something that is already much more fairly priced than you can get elsewhere. Again, support Moore's Law is Dead at CDkeyoffer.com today. Yeah, it's funny. I'm guessing you agree with this. Like, we know we have the 9070 XT with 16, 9070 with 16. We've seen leaks, easy to believe, I think, of 9060 XT 16 gigabyte cards. Unfortunately, those leaks almost always include that they will have an 8 gigabyte variant. I guess if you can buy one or the other, I don't know. I guess you can allow both. But my opinion is that AMD shouldn't release any card this generation unless it's below like $250, let's be honest, $200. That's only 8 gigabytes. So there shouldn't be a 9060 only 8 gig with no 16 gigabyte option, because it makes less sense than just pumping out 16 gigabyte 7600 XTs for like $300 or less, in my opinion. I wonder if you agree with that, that like it would even make more sense to like rebrand a 16 gigabyte last gen card below 300 than to launch a new 8 gigabyte card at $299 or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's an easy win for an AMD, really, to have all cards with sufficient VRAM. And I don't see any real technical reason why they wouldn't be able to do it. Like, I know you're saying rebrand old models. I think any current or new generation card they're coming out with that has 8 gigabytes should just be able to be clamshelled into 16.
Yes.
Unless the memory bus is so low that they're clamshelling it to 8, which would just be ridiculous to
I
do.
don't think they're going to do that. We'll see, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think they will either. I think any reasonable configuration should have some sort of 16 gig model. And if AMD is genuine about trying to be more competitive and build market share, it's just one of those easy things where it doesn't require more innovation on the GPU die or anything. It's just about adding the VRAM to the cards. It's just that simple, very easy to do. And yeah, I mean, having the 16 and 8 gig models, sure, it's not great to have the 8 gig card, probably doesn't make a lot of sense. I feel the issue with that in the past has been the focus has always been the lower VRAM card. So that's kind of set the price to performance level. And then it's been a thing where you pay more to access the 16 gig version. Like 4060 Ti, the price of the 8 gig model made sense for the performance of the card. It didn't really make sense because it wasn't giving you much over the 3060 Ti. But the cost per frame was very similar to a 3060 Ti for the 8 gig card. Once you get to the 16 gig card, the cost per frame for the performance side of things goes out the window. You're paying more for the same level of performance, but then you're getting more VRAM. That should be flipped this generation. Everything should be based around the higher VRAM capacity card. So in an AMD example, 9060 XT, you'd base where you think the performance needs to be for the 16 gig card. So you go whatever, if it's 20% slower, you make it 20% cheaper. That's what you're paying for the 16 gig model.
So like if it's 7700 XT performance, you're not going to go, oh, well, 8 gigabytes, $400 is $50 cheaper. It's like, no, with 16 gigabytes, it's $50 cheaper at $399. And then the 8 gigabytes should be a massive discount. You should think of it from the high capacity price performance versus last gen first.
Yeah, that's right. So then the focus in reviews and things is on the 16 gig model. So you can look at the cost per frame charts, the performance charts, and people are thinking about, well, how does this perform in terms of FPS relative to previous gen models? How does it stack up based on value? And people won't be going, oh, well, okay, so the price to performance makes sense, but I'm only getting 8 gigabytes. That was the issue with the previous generation. And then you go to the 16 gig cards and the price to performance made no sense, but you were getting the amount of VRAM that was required. With this generation, if everything's based on the 16 gig card, you can look at the price to performance, go, that makes sense. It's in a position where it's acceptable and I'm getting enough VRAM. And then you have the 8 gig card, which becomes really a model people won't buy. But if there are people that want to save a small amount of money, or they know they're only doing esports gaming or something where
I keep
games don't
saying they should
require
just
that.
make it a GRE for China and call it a day, because that's what it is. It shouldn't. I don't know any
Yeah.
other market that really wants that.
Well, that's right. I think it wouldn't make much sense. I think the sales would be quite poor if they did come out with an 8 gig model. So really, they could just go with the 16 gig card. But yeah, what we don't want to see are things like the 16 gig model being $100 more expensive, or even $50 more, which then brings it out of the reasonable performance to, price to performance ratio level. Those are all the issues that they've had in the past, where things like, the 7600 was not the best value, had 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Then they, for $60 more, gave you the 7600 XT with 16 gig, which also wasn't the best value, but gave you enough VRAM. If they just made the 7600 a 16 gig card and they priced it at $300, the price to performance ratio would have made sense relative to like a 4060, and it would have given you double the VRAM. It would have been a much more compelling card. So those are the sorts of decisions I'd like to see AMD make with their lower tier models, and really Nvidia as well, because we're pretty sure they're going to do 5060 Ti 8 and 16
Yeah.
gig models. Everything should be anchored around the 16 gig card, which is not what they did in the previous generation. If we're seeing like a $500 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte when the 8 gig model is $400, whatever, that's ridiculous. Not going to fly. So long as the 16 gig card makes sense, then that card has a chance of being successful. So it's really as simple as that. Just give people enough VRAM. AMD's been talking about giving gamers what they want. Gamers want enough VRAM. It's not that expensive. So just do it.
And on that note, not that expensive. I mean, I think NVIDIA's maybe a little more of a pickle because they decided to use GDDR7. Although for the most part, I think it would be because of, I don't know if there'd be any supply constraints because it's new. Maybe there's not, though. Maybe there is no excuse for it. But at least AMD chose GDDR6. From what I've heard, those prices have never been lower. Like, I've heard they're like $2 to $5, let's say, dollars a gigabyte right now. And so why I would think it wouldn't just be like a missed opportunity, but a truly stupid decision to not give it 16 gigabytes is, so wait, at this point, we're talking like $20 extra to double the RAM. I know a lot of people that don't want to pay $300 for an 8 gigabyte card, but would happily pay $350 for a 16 gigabyte card. Like, you're actually allowing yourself, I would think, to make more profit too, because of how cheap RAM's gotten this year. And so it actually will blow my mind if they don't do that, because here's your legitimate chance to upsell people.
Yeah, I agree. I think companies are always worried about margin. So even though you could add $20 more component cost to get $30 more out of the sale, that actually hurts their
Exactly.
margin. So that's something they're always worried about. I think
you could add $50 though easily for 20. I mean, and that's what blows my mind if they won't do it.
I think they probably could. I think AMD, I don't know why they're overly concerned about margins. I mean, obviously, executive stuff. There are reasons for all that. I think it's silly. They should be building market share, doing things that gamers want. And so long as they're not doing things that make cards cost money to give to gamers, so they're actually still making money from cards, then taking all the easy wins that are available is absolutely what they should be doing. And so, adding what ultimately isn't a huge component cost to the models. It's not that difficult to engineer the cards. It doesn't require crazy amounts of space or anything. It's something AIBs have been familiar with doing for ages now. Clamshelling is not a new thing. So
the PS4 did it in a $400 box in 2013. I mean,
yeah. So, I mean, if they're listening to the market, they're listening to what people are actually saying about GPUs and what they want. The sentiment is loud and clear. Like, they don't need to do any crazy research to figure out what VRAM amounts people want at the entry level and mid range of the market. It's there for people to see. And if they want to make an 8 gig card for whatever reason, make it super cheap, fair enough. If that's the lowest product in the stack and it's under $200, they're just trying to flat them out, make something that's has a low BOM cost and is easy to produce, and you can just make that the anchor, the very low part of the market, fine, whatever. But so long as the cards that are in the ranges that a lot of gamers are spending money on, so $200 to $400, which is where a lot of people buy cards, if they're sufficient, I think they're in with a really good chance of making a real splash in the market. And people are seeing the things with the current models, the 9070 XT. It's got enough VRAM. They've improved the upscaling. They've improved the video encoding quality. They've kind of hit a lot of those things that gamers have complained about. So it'd just be crazy for me to not extend that into VRAM for the lower tier cards. And I think they will do it. It's just a matter of, are they going to have brain fog about pricing again and make that not make any sense for the models they're producing, or are they going to come out of the bat and make sure that the 16 gig card's the card that is easy to produce? I mean, yeah, maybe NVIDIA's going to have some issues with G7 memory. My understanding is it's not that much more expensive than G6, but it's more
no, that's
supply
why I
side
wonder.
of things. But
Yeah, supply. That's what I would worry about. But I don't know. Maybe they have plenty of supply.
Yeah, well, they've got a lot of models to make with G7, and they've pumped out all these cards pretty quickly. So you'd hope they have a lot of supply. But obviously, there's been supply issues for their GPU. So who knows what's going on there? But it almost doesn't matter to me. It's kind of like, yeah, okay, so G7 maybe is more expensive and has supply issues, right? Not my problem. As a gamer,
I agree.
I don't care. I don't care if you put in the wrong memory bus so you can't make a 12 gig model, you're stuck with 8 or 16 gig and you can't use the 3 gig G7 chips for whatever reason. Not my problem. All it means is you have to eat margin and make it a 16 gig card when theoretically previously you could have made some other more optimal configuration. I don't care. You just have to do what has to be done. And as a gamer, I'm just not going to spend the money on an insufficient substandard product.
No, yeah, I agree. I would just say the things that I'm saying about GDDR7 supply are just how I explain why they're doing what they're doing right now. That doesn't mean I think it makes, like, why doesn't the 5070 have a 256-bit bus? In fact, I'd go as far as to say when we see the 5090 get like 30% more performance than the 4090 while doubling bandwidth, that makes me wonder, like, wouldn't the card maybe have been cheaper too to just be 256-bit GDDR6, 192-bit GDDR6 instead of wasting GDDR7 on low-end products that don't have enough RAM? Like, that's just their fault for configuring these wrong.
Yeah, I think NVIDIA's talked in the past about, some of the reasons why they use the memory buses that they do. It's not just about the cost and trying to make these silly configurations and upsell you on all those sorts of things. It's also about the edge width of the GPU dies. Because
they want to fit them in laptop too.
Yeah, because the memory controller has to go along the edge of the GPU die. If you increase the bus width, you have to increase the edge width of the GPU, which can make some interesting shapes which are not optimal. So it could mean that your GPU has to be longer and thinner. So it's kind of, instead of being more of a square shape, you have to make it more of a elongated rectangle, if you're sort of following what I'm saying. So that can be some of that. At least that's an explanation I've been given as to why you don't see extremely large memory buses on smaller GPU dies, is because they're trying to keep the area the same, but it may not be optimal to use that shape. But it still doesn't change. Like, okay, you make a GPU die, it's for the mid-range, it's a certain size. You're limited to whatever memory bus makes sense for the width and size of the GPU. Okay, whatever. Doesn't limit you in terms of the actual VRAM capacity. It just limits you in the configurations you can use. It doesn't, like, having a 128-bit bus doesn't mean it has to be 8 gig. 192-bit doesn't mean it has to be 12 gig. There are other configurations that are possible. And yeah, if you design the GPU to be like that, so that's your option that you're left with, it just means you have to go with the higher configuration. That's all. You have to spend a bit more money on the VRAM. That's it. Or use the new 3 gig chips, which seem to be, I don't know, maybe they're more supply constrained or expensive, but seem to largely be going to the laptops and pro cards. Hopefully at some point that will be a solution for consumer GPUs as well, but it just seems to be not something they're doing at the moment.
Well, I will say that's going to shock me too if, and I believe this is probably what's going to happen from what I'm seeing, the 5060 Ti has an 8 and a 16 gigabyte model, because when I first heard, I don't know, a year ago that they were going to go with GDDR7 even for the 106 die, which the 5060 Ti should use, I was like, oh, well, that must be so that they can give it the 12 gigabyte chips, which would be perfect for like a $400 card. And so if they end up giving it 16, I'm really going to scratch my head and go, well, I actually don't know why you did that, because I thought that was the whole point, is you could use the new higher density chips, and you're not.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they're stockpiling all of those for the over $8,000 RTX Pro 6000 that they're using with 96 gig. I'm not sure. Maybe there's less supply of that than they anticipated. There's all sorts of reasons that they could go into it, but I think probably the biggest reason, at a guess, would be just product segmentation. They want to make the most money they can from these cards. Having the 8 gig and 16 gig means you can charge $100 more for the 16 gig card. You try and upsell people as much as possible. And then, for the lower tier models, it opens the door for a super series that can correct the VRAM of all the cards. In the future,
Yeah.
when things are a bit cheaper, they can make more money from that again, upsell you again. So that seems to be the reason, when we've talked to Nvidia about why the 5070 and other models have the VRAM that they do, they've said the reason is we're not expecting gamers to enable all features on a 5070. The 5070 is not the card for people to enable everything. I think that is a cop-out answer. You spend $550, right?
I thought that was supposed to be the 60 last time I checked, but okay. Now at least they're admitting the 70 is basically the new 60.
Well, I would have thought that when you're spending the money on those high-end cards, that's for people who want 4K high refresh rate gaming using ultra settings with ray tracing, all the bells and whistles enabled. Fair enough. That's for those gamers. But for 5070, it should still be about your 1440p, decent refresh rate, ultra settings type gaming. That is being limited by VRAM in some games. So I don't know. It's a bad answer in my opinion from Nvidia on that one, but that's what they're claiming, and it makes sense when you look at the lineup that they're producing. They clearly are intending you to spend more so that you can enable all the features. They clearly don't see the 5070 as that it used to be like the gold card in the lineup, the model that was the most attractive, that everyone would want to buy, that would be great for all sorts of gaming, and then you target the whales with the 80s and the TIs, the 80 TIs and the 90s, that sort of thing. Those days are gone. They're just not interested in doing that. The 5070 is like it's almost like a peasant GPU. Like, you couldn't afford $800. Oh, well, sucks to be you, I guess. So here's the scraps. And then what are you getting below that? Well, I don't even know. The dirt below the scraps. Who knows?
All right. Well, we've been dancing around talking about features here for a while. So let's just get into that. I mean, you've done a lot of testing on FSR 4, DLSS 4. You've also, of course, tested XT super sampling and a lot of other new features as well. But how would you summarize the state of DLSS versus FSR versus PSSR? I don't know if you've I know you've looked at PSSR some. I remember actually you were, when I leaked PSSR a year ago, you were the first guest to come on and talk about what that looked like too a year ago.
Yeah, I can't comment too much on PSSR because I don't own a PS5 Pro, so I've never really used it. I've seen, obviously, analysis from people like Digital Foundry, but that's as far as it's gone for me. So I'll probably just keep it to the DLSS versus FSR stuff.
Sure.
I mean, yeah, I think, I guess to go back like before the launch, I was testing DLSS 4 prior to testing FSR 4. I hadn't had access to FSR 4 at the time. And DLSS 4 was a pretty big improvement. I was really impressed with it. And I was quite concerned about the competitive landscape of the GPU market, just because I was having chats with Steve about it. I'm like, well, if DLSS 4 has going to be in this position where the performance mode is superior to, let's say, FSR 3.1 quality mode, then that's going to be really difficult for benchmarking, because if we're recommending people use the performance mode and then FSR is even worse using the quality mode, then do we have to change the way we do benchmarking and that sort of thing? So I certainly had concerns prior to testing everything that would be in this situation where the gap would just continue to widen. Because I think since the launch of FSR 2 or whatever, the gap between the technologies has widened more and more. NVIDIA's done a lot of work with DLSS to improve it, and AMD was lagging behind with their gains for FSR. So the fact that AMD managed to significantly improve FSR with FSR 4 has closed the gap, when I was maybe expecting it to either be maintained or maybe go the opposite direction, just because of how impressive I found DLSS 4. But yeah, I mean, I found it really impressive how FSR 4 was able to come out and in many ways outperform DLSS 3, which was sort of the standard that everyone was using prior to this year for image quality. The best way to play games was often with DLSS 3 upscaling or DLAA or whatever. And to have FSR 4 come out and, like I said, in some areas that we've tested, it's delivers better image quality than that, I think is a really good step forward. And okay, yeah, it's not as good as DLSS 4 in some scenarios. Still haven't completed the testing of all the resolutions, so not quite sure how it goes at 1080p, only a little way into sort of the 4K stuff. I'm expecting it to be better than 1440p that tends to be how.
Yes.
So I can sort of guess how that's going to go, not really sure about 1080p. But yeah, I think they're in a really good position. It's in a lot of games, FSR3 was unusable at the resolutions people often play at. So 1080p, FSR, FSR 2.2 is really bad at 1080p. It delivers bad image quality in a lot of games. At 1440p, not great as well. Some games you kind of got lucky. A lot of games, as you would have seen in some of the examples that we showed, quite ugly, a lot of issues, a lot of artifacts, and it was okay at 4K. But the issue was gamers weren't buying AMD GPUs to play at 4K. They were often the
Mhm.
mid-range entry-level cards, so they were stuck with this 1440p kind of crappy experience. Now we're in such a different position. You can buy a 9070 XT for 1440p gaming, use FSR4, and be really happy with the experience. I think I would certainly be happy playing games with FSR4 all day. The real issue they've got at the moment is just the massive difference in game support between DLSS, a quality level of DLSS, whether that's DLSS 3 or 4. A lot of games support that. FSR4, not as many games, not nearly as many games. There seem to be some games as well that I would have expected to have FSR4, like Assassin's Creed
Mm.
Shadows, which launched with FSR 3.1. I would have expected the day one driver to allow the upgrade to FSR4. As far as my understanding is, I haven't played the game, so I don't know whether the situation now is that that's still the case. But certainly at launch of that game, you couldn't upgrade it. So those are sort of the things that they need to work on there. So that's kind of the current situation. I think it's a much more competitive landscape. The quality is better. You'd be happy using FSR4. DLSS 4 is obviously really good as well. So the gap is closed between the two. It's just more of a game support thing at the moment. And then AMD obviously has to clean up some of those edge cases where DLSS 4 is still delivering better image quality. It does deliver better image quality in general, so there's that. But it's worlds different to what it would have been had FSR 4 not came out. They would have gotten absolutely destroyed had FSR 4 not been available with this generation.
Yeah, and it's interesting though. I would say, at least from where I'm sitting, and hopefully this is an indication of a trend and not just a blip, but doesn't it seem like, at least at launch here, AMD is indicating they're going to get more support faster this time around than last time? Because I remember FSR 3.1 announced, or like even just 3 announced with RDNA 3, and it was like, okay, where is it? And like half a year went by. I feel like we've already got more games supporting FSR 4, at least to some degree, especially because you can kind of force it on, than we got with FSR even 3.1, like a year after it was out. It was seriously like, where is the support? So would you agree it at least looks like they're taking this more seriously?
Yeah, I mean, the driver upgrade feature certainly helps a lot with that. They can just immediately, if game developers have been working on a title with FSR 3.1, theoretically, I just brought up an example where it's not the case, but theoretically, for all games, it should just be able to be upgraded easily. So that gives them a much better footing to release FSR 4 to gamers, because previously it was on game developers to put the technology in their games. It's obviously a very slow process, and Nvidia did the exact same thing with DLSS 4. The vast majority of DLSS 4 supported titles are not native integrations. They're doing a driver upgrade situation. So that's helped them out massively. But I think there's many other areas that help them out with game support. I think maybe when we came on last time and talked about this, but I've talked about it on our podcast, the Hardware Unboxed podcast as well, about how the whole reason behind FSR, what I think AMD was doing in terms of trying to minimize DLSS support, make this upscaler for everyone so that game developers would not have to use DLSS in games. I think that failed as a strategy. I don't think it worked long term.
Mm.
DLSS was able to establish itself and be a go-to for game developers to integrate into games. Gamers demanded it in games effectively. Like you kind of get negative reviews and feedback if you don't put it in your games. So that strategy didn't work. And so were game developers sort of feeling this situation where, like most gamers have an NVIDIA GPU on PC. Do I really need to integrate this worse version of upscaling for a minority of GPU owners, when I could just put in DLSS and kind of leave the FSR to be whatever version we were working on from years ago, FSR 2.2 or whatever, instead of really going in and upgrading it to the latest version and doing all that sort of thing. They would have seen market share trends, more gamers buying GeForce over time, more need for DLSS, less need for FSR. I think with this generation, there's so many reasons why that's no longer the case. The quality is much better, so the effort that you put into you put in this new feature, this upscaling, it's actually delivering a much better experience for gamers. It's something that gamers would actually want to use. They're going to be enabling it, something that's worth putting in for that reason. Then there's all the excitement around the 9070 XT and probably just the XT model, flying off shelves. People really want the card, lots of hype around it, lots of excitement. So that's helping as well, because previously AMD GPUs, not a lot of hype, not a lot of excitement, kind of mediocre reception. And so all those things are sort of combining. You've got the driver upgrade feature that's helping game developers out a bit. You've got the actual quality of the feature being better, so your effort is justified to put it in or support it. And then people are excited to buy the GPUs that are required to run it. And game developers benefit from integrating FSR anyway, because you integrate the version 4 of version 3.1, it's still backwards compatible, still gives you that broad support that you're already doing with FSR 3.1. So all those things make it so much better for game developers. And I think that will help them gain broader adoption. Because as we saw at the FSR 3 launch with their frame generation, the games they got it in were embarrassing. The launch was embarrassing, really poor quality launch. This time around, totally different. So that's been good to see.
Yeah, and I think it's also important that I guess FSR 4, although it could theoretically run on NVIDIA's latest GPUs, it's on NVIDIA to make it work on them, not on AMD. Like, you still have this thing where if you're a developer, okay, well, a lot of NVIDIA's generations can't even use DLSS 3, let alone 4. At least if I have this, now the hot new AMD card can use it, that a lot of people have. But also, Pascal can run FSR 3.1, and Intel's integrated graphics can run FSR 3.1, and presumably eventually 4 if they add support to it. And it's like, I think the argument works a lot better for we need to include this feature because NVIDIA doesn't even let some of their cards use their features, when at least the hot new cards also look good and people will want to use them, right? It's not just, oh, I guess we'll add this for those people that still have a 1060. It's like both popular now, and you can make the argument that some of the worse versions of it can still run on all these NVIDIA GPUs as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've seen Intel sort of do that with XeSS, right? They've got the high quality version for their GPUs, and then the sort of fallback backup version that game developers can integrate, which is probably 99% of gamers using XeSS are probably using the fallback version because Intel's market share is not big. But
well, and I have to say, I've had some developers reach out to me and say XE Super Sampling 2 is like, it's in one game. There's bugs. And I had one developer, actually, I can say who it is. It's Matt from Alderon Games, who's been a guest on the podcast a few times. He's been on Windows channel a few times as well. Like, Intel isn't showing indication they're adding support to more games anytime soon. So I think this is also a really good time for AMD to do this, because Intel's kind of entirely, I don't know, dropping the ball on proving XE Super Sampling 2 is something a lot of games are going to implement moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something I care too much about XeSS 2 because it's just the frame generation component, and frame gen is something I'm not as excited about as the upscaling side of things. So, XeSS, the XMX upscaling version, is pretty good. I actually don't know how it compares to the latest versions of DLSS and FSR. I need to go back and have a look at that. But last time I looked at it, it was pretty good. But I think, the reason why XeSS prior to 2, obviously 2's having some struggles, the prior versions were getting into games was, because of the fallback versions, the broad support sort of thing, which, AMD's sort of continuing with FSR 4. I think the exclusivity, though, isn't necessarily bad. AMD needs features to convince people to buy Radeon cards. And although it's a feature where their competitors have alternate versions of the features, it kind of, I guess, it's like a Mindshare sort of thing, a Mindshare marketing sort of thing. Like, we're helping Radeon gamers with Radeon features. Previously, it's been about we're making features and you can use them on whatever. Whereas, like, what's the thing that's keeping people in the Radeon brand, that gets people excited about Radeon software sorts of things? And so something like FSR4 is like, well, it's, you know how people are a bit tribal with these GPU things, is the whole fanboy.
Yes, I've noticed the comments.
A lot of fanboys, right? Fanboys love these sorts of things, love these exclusive things that you can have, you know, arguments about, make videos about. And so having this sort of thing for them, I think will benefit the marketing side of things.
Mm.
And yeah, people have been disappointed. We've seen comments obviously about, oh, FSR4 is not available on older GPUs, at least for now. Not sure whether it'll ever come, but yeah, who knows? Maybe they're working on it. We'll see. But I think the sort of broad support thing, as I said earlier, hasn't really worked. It hasn't led to more Radeon sales, hasn't led to more market share. So trying something different, making the feature as good as they can for the best hardware that they've got on the market today is the best way forward for them. And so, yeah, maybe they'll be able to make a not as good version that runs on older GPUs. Sure, whatever. The focus, though, should be, let's make this feature no compromises. No need to worry about those old cards. No need to make it work on everything. We've got our new AI accelerators in this GPU. Let's make it as good as possible for that. And honestly, I think if they had tried to make this work on old cards, it would have just been a mess, probably worse quality, and it wouldn't have gotten the reception that it's gotten from gamers. And yeah, okay, it's a little disappointing that you have to upgrade to a 9070 XT to get that, but you know, AMD needs to be convincing GeForce owners to switch over to AMD. The only way to do that is having a good quality feature. And yeah, okay, so a 7900 XT owner gets a bit burnt there, but their market share is terrible. So they've just got to do things to convince the majority of people, which are GeForce owners, to switch over.
This piece of content is brought to you by JLC PCB, a trusted partner for easy, affordable, and reliable PCBs and PCBA solutions. They have 19 years of expertise since 2006, and they help electronics engineers bring their projects to life efficiently. Why choose them? Well, because they have unbeatable prices. You can get 1 to 8 layer PCB starting at just $2. They have large-scale production and cost-effective manufacturing for unbeatable value, and this is in-house production with full control over every process, ensuring quality and stability and strict quality control. So get your PCBs produced in as little as 24 hours. And right now they have a special offer. You get 5 pieces of 100 by 100 millimeter 2-layer flex PCBs for only $2. And this supports Pi, FR4, and 3 MTake stiffeners. And so check out the link in the description to get access to this deal and support Moore's Law is Dead today. Yeah, and I know that there were like little driver leaks a couple years ago about AMD playing around with some, I think it's, what is it, Int8 accelerated version of an FSR4 on RDNA 3. I certainly heard that from some people I talked to myself. I think there's a lot of people that are like, well, we see these weird leaks and whispers here, like, where is it? And I really do think that there was a decision here. And I should say this too, like, AMD has already said they're going to help Sony port FSR4 to the, I don't know what you call it, RDNA 3.75 that's in the PS5 Pro, which at a minimum it doesn't have FP8, so it can't do the FSR4 that's on RDNA 4. And so that would therefore make you go, oh, well then there's going to be some version of this that has to come to 3 eventually. But I think AMD said, we just need RDNA 4 to have a perfect launch. Who cares about the other generation? If there's any chance that trying to have a simultaneous, Int8 variant of this work as well, we're going to lose sight on what we really need, which is perfect RX 9070 XT reviews.
Yeah, I think that plays into it for sure. And also the issue is when you have this feature that's available on old GPUs, like, is the version that's backported the Int8 approximation or whatever, is that going to be exactly the same as FSR4 on the full RDNA 4 cards, or is it going to be a degraded version? And
so I actually think I can answer this to a degree because it's interesting. The PS5 Pro is like some weird hybrid RDNA 3, RDNA 4 architecture that has actually like a boatload of Int8. I don't remember what it was, but it's like it has 2 to 3 times the Int8 performance of a 7900 XTX, which on paper is a much stronger graphics card than what's in the PS5 Pro. And so I think I could believe they could get at least 90% of the way to FSR4 with Int8 on the PS5 Pro. But I would say whatever they do to do that is probably going to run at least, like, if you're getting a 30 FPS boost with RDNA 4, my guess is the 7900 XTX is going to get like a 20% boost with somewhat similar image quality, and maybe like one ghosting thing is dropped from some calculation, you know?
Sure. I guess whether it's image quality or performance, the end result is kind of, some area to it is not as good as what you'd see from the full version of FSR 4. And, the issue that I would have is sort of, at least if I was thinking about it from an AMD perspective and a gaming perspective, is you want to have a good impression for these features when people use them for the first time. And so if you're backporting a version of FSR 4 that either maybe has reduced image quality or maybe doesn't run as well as what you're used to from an upscaler, because it's has to do more calculations on hardware that's not doesn't have the hardware to do it, is that going to be something that's going to convince people to upgrade to a new AMD GPU to access the full good quality version of FSR 4? So that's something that they're probably going to have to sort out. Like, do you release a version that's compromised in some way to just make it work on old cards if that's going to compromise sales of new models? Because, if it's available on NVIDIA GPUs, I think one of the issues that AMD has had in convincing people to switch from GeForce to Radeon is that GeForce owners can use FSR 3. So they can enable it, compare it to DLSS themselves on their own systems before deciding about a Radeon card, and make their conclusion that it's not as good. And so I don't want to switch, right? So by having these features where, it's kind of, we can say as reviewers what it's like and how good it is. And then gamers, once they get their first hands-on from it, from buying a card, are going to see similar sorts of things. If they're releasing some sort of FSR 4 Lite that maybe has a same or similar name, but it's not as good in some way with performance, image quality, not sure, is that convincing people to then use Radeon, like upgrade to the new Radeon card? Are they going to be able to convince people that the experience from the full FSR 4 is actually better than the version that they're using, which may have a similar name or something along those lines? I mean, they could call it FSR 3 improved or something. I guess it would maybe solve that, but there's a lot of challenges there. I think that the way they've gone with the exclusive features ensures that when gamers use FSR 4 for the first time, it's the full quality version, the best quality version, and you're going to be impressed with that. Whereas some sort of backported, lower quality version, if that hurts Radeon's ability to sell GPUs, that's not what they need at the moment. They've tried the whole, let's make it work on everything, let's do the best thing for gamers. And I would love to see FSR 4 work as good as it does on older hardware. But the reason that you were probably not getting that is because AMD didn't invest as much in the AI stuff early enough. And so they're kind of in that position where, it's unfortunate that those cards can't run it. I don't know. Maybe they could make a version of FSR 4 that runs badly on old GPUs. So then you see it and you're like, oh, but I've heard this runs so much better on new cards.
That's what I was going to say.
I don't know.
Because I think you bring up a good point that if AMD were to lean towards two directions, I haven't thought about this before. Like, should they do FSR 4, 90% is good, but it gives you the same performance boost? Or should they do FSR 4 99% is good, but you get a 10 to 20% boost instead of 30 to 40? They should probably do the latter. And I was just looking up to like the Int 8 performance of various graphics cards. And it's like, I think they could probably get away with that with a 7900 XTX. Like, it's a 15% boost, but it looks as good. And so if you're a 7900 XTX owner, you go, oh, wow, this actually looks just as good. Heck, if you're an NVIDIA person, you could probably try it and go, oh, wow, AMD looks as good. And if I had a 9070 XT, I'd be getting more performance than what I'm getting right now with a, I don't know, 2080 or something. I will say that going to Pascal, it's 45 tops of int performance. So I think it would probably run like a slideshow on Pascal and earlier. So you're not really going to get a benefit marketing that.
Yeah, I mean, those cards can't even run DLSS though, so they're probably
maybe
a lot
it would
of
help
incentive.
Still, I don't know.
Maybe a lot of incentive there, but yeah, I mean, DLSS 4, that's what Nvidia did. They released one model, the new model, and it runs worse on older architectures because the older architectures aren't as fast. That's just the way it is. So if you want the best experience with DLSS 4, you have to upgrade to a new card. I don't know. You'd have to ensure though, at the very least, that you're getting an experience that would incentivize you to upgrade when you try the version of FSR 4 that's available on old cards. If it in any way disincentivizes you from upgrading, then they should not release it. That's just my opinion on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Nathan Sheed writes in on comparing DLSS versus FSR image quality. I would imagine that comparing the 9070 XT and the 5090 is unfair unless a frame limiter is used. Trails and ghosting remains visible for a certain number of frames, so the card with a higher frame rate will give less apparent ghosting. This also poses a question about the possibility of some sort of implementation like Radeon Boost, which could retain a shorter history of frames during fast movement and hold more when there's no movement. Kind of like how those professional programs that take a full minute to path trace a full resolution frame work. I think what he's kind of getting at is when you compare DLSS to FSR, do you think you probably have to compare 5070 Ti to 9070 XT so that the perfectly smooth frame rates, because the 5090 is just brute forcing it, isn't maybe giving you a little more data for better image quality?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely different quality levels that you get depending on the frame rate. That's so, all the comparisons you'd see on our channel are all 60 FPS footage, just to make sure that the footage is exactly the same. You gain the same frame rate. Yeah, because there's it's the classic thing with upscaling. The more that happens between frames, the larger the difference is, the more difficulty they have reconstructing it temporally. That's
Mm-hmm.
so 30 FPS looks awful. You get to really high frame rates, small difference, even in fast motion. It allows the algorithm to work better and more efficiently. Same sort of thing with frame generation. So it's kind of some issues with, as we've mentioned many times in the past, low frame rate frame gen isn't great. So yes, certainly it doesn't make a lot of sense to compare like a 9070 XT to a 5090 in terms of their actual output, because the 5090 is so much faster. It'll run upscaling at a much higher frame rate, which will reduce the visual quality differences. It'll make it look better, basically. And it can run at higher resolutions, which again is another area that benefits upscaling. The higher the resolution, the better it works. So yeah, the 9070 XT really should be compared to a 5070 Ti because it's sort of similar performance class. That's how we compared it for the performance, the frame rate sort of things, as well as the image quality. But yeah, I mean, any visual analysis really just lock the frame rate, and all that will take care of itself. It doesn't really matter if a 5090 is way more powerful if you're still rendering it at 60 FPS. So the output's still 60. The gap between each frame is still the same. So you get a similar sort of impact, in terms of the quality that it can do at that level of frame rate.
Well, so on the note of high resolutions, Titus writes in, presumably from Xanarkand, and says, "Hi Tim. Now that DLSS and FSR4 are good, do you think 8K gaming might make a comeback? Going from a high DPI laptop display to a 4K desktop monitor is still pretty rough for text clarity." I don't know. I doubt it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with 8K gaming is just the lack of displays, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in making 8K gaming displays. Maybe that's again like a chicken and egg situation. You don't make 8K gaming displays because no GPUs can do 8K gaming, despite what Nvidia tries to claim at times. So, the panel manufacturers don't make the panels, the GPU makers don't make the GPUs, so there's no real need for 8K. Yeah, personally, I don't think 8K gaming, at least for the panel sizes that most people use, will ever, I wouldn't say ever, but it's a long way off from that being something that gamers would really want. I don't think the clarity difference you're talking about like a 27 or 32 inch panel. It may look a little better. I don't think it'll be a massive like, oh, I've got to have my 8K gaming display with my 5090. The 5090, it isn't even really fast enough to do like 4K path tracing in a lot of games. Like if you're talking about the best visual quality that we're getting in today's games at 4K, it really struggles even with upscaling in some titles. It's just not really fast enough. So 8K gaming, okay, yeah, you could use DLSS ultra performance, I guess. I just don't really see that being something that's coming anytime soon. And we'd really, I guess, as gamers need to accept even larger panels, like maybe a 42-inch panel, like things that could really benefit from the high 8K resolution. Obviously, if you're gaming on really massive TVs, then yeah, 8K gaming is going to be something that is potentially important. But 4K hasn't even really made a huge splash yet. 4K is still much less popular than 1440p. And as I said, the GPUs, no matter what Nvidia says, their GPUs are not powerful enough for 8K gaming. So a lot of work to go there.
Well, and it becomes a vicious cycle because, like the chicken and egg thing, the more people don't make 8K panels, the more they just spit out tons of different 4K panels, the more those 4K panels become cheaper. So it's like, are you really going to spend $2,000 or even 1,500, 1,200 for an 8K when 4K OLED is going below $800 now? Like, are you really going to spend that much more? And I think 8K will eventually become kind of a standard, but it's going to be when it's so stupidly cheap to just make it 8K instead of 4K, like 5-10 years from now, that people will go, well, if it's kind of what eventually happened to 4K versus 1440p, where you're like, well, if it's only $200 more, I mean, sure, I'll get 4K. I think that's what it's going to take for 8K, except maybe doubly so because of the diminishing returns.
Yeah, I mean, I think 4K compared to 1440p is an upgrade at a lot of normal desktop sizes. So like 27-inch or 32-inch. It's probably even more of an issue now that there's LCDs and there's OLED. So 4K versus 1440p OLED is different to 4K versus 1440p LCD. You get even more of a gain on the OLED side just because 1440p OLED isn't great. But then, would I prefer a 4K 240Hz OLED or an 8K 240Hz LCD? I definitely would go with the OLED.
Yeah.
So how far off are we from having 8K OLEDs? Because 8K LCD is a thing. It's just not high refresh at the moment or at the high enough refresh to justify gaming people buying it. Whereas, they've just got the 27-inch 4K OLEDs. So how far away are we from 8K at that? I don't know. A long time, I would have thought. I think that the next step, they're doing 5K panels, which might be a good intermediate. Especially, I think, you might be able to get an improvement from a 32-inch 5K panel, but 8K seems like it's a fair way off.
Yeah, I think it really could be a decade. Carbon Cry writes in, hello, Tim Tom. Does AMD need multi-frame gen? I personally hate frame gen, but I get some may prefer fake smoothness, even if it comes at the price of sluggishness and significant visual degradation. But what I cannot comprehend is anyone using multi-frame gen. Latency is further magnified and visual degradation is incredibly bad. Why could anyone feel MFG doesn't completely destroy the experience of playing a game?
Well, this person really hates frame gen, don't they? I think there's a lot of things in this, question I probably wouldn't agree with. Significant visual degradation depends. Fake smoothness. I think it is real smoothness. It's just that the latency is not brought up to the same level as the smoothness. So it is smoother because it's generating more frames. So whether or not it's fake smoothness, I mean, it's the whole fake frames thing, right? The visual degradation incredibly bad. Yeah, not sure about that. Why would anyone feel multi-frame generation doesn't completely destroy the gaming experience? Well, in my opinion, if you're using multi-frame generation on a lower refresh rate monitor, like 144 hertz, you probably won't like it. It's probably not going to give you that much of an improvement, especially if you're, limiting your frame rates. You're actually seeing all of the 3x or 4x, generating 2 frames or 3 frames. If you're really in the configuration where you're seeing all those frames, probably not a very good experience. If you're using on a high refresh rate monitor, like a genuinely high refresh 240 or 360 hertz monitor, that's when you can comprehend why you might use frame generation. Because if you're taking 120 FPS and bringing it up to 480 FPS or 360 FPS or whatever, it is smoother, it is a good experience, and you're not hurting latency all that much, especially for single player gaming. Obviously, for multiplayer, you wouldn't use it. But for single player gaming, that experience is, I would say, pretty good. If you've got a 4K 240 hertz panel, you're taking your, around that 80 to 100 FPS base frame rate, using frame gen to get up to a higher, it feels and plays pretty good. So that's where you would use it. Does AMD need an answer to multi-frame gen? I don't think it's that compelling of a feature. So, maybe they need it to check a box. AMD loves checking off their marketing boxes.
That's my opinion, is they need to check the box at a minimum.
So I can't imagine it's that difficult to turn FSR, the current version, into multi-frame gen, because we've seen, software solutions, lossless scaling can do like however many times multi-frame gen. Obviously the quality, there's question marks over that. But yeah, so they need it for that angle. I guess I see multi-frame gen, and Nvidia definitely disagrees with this based on how they've marketed cards, but I see it as a feature for very high-end gamers, people that have those 4K 240 hertz panels the 360 hertz OLEDs, 480 hertz OLEDs. It's for those people. And those people are probably buying 5090s, 5080s, high-end GPUs. And AMD doesn't have a high-end GPU that competes with those cards. So are people really going to be pairing a 9070 XT with these expensive high-end monitors that you need to use multi-frame gen to get the best experience? Probably not. So most people are probably going to be okay with the single frame gen on the monitors that you'd be expecting to pair with those sorts of mid-range cards. The only reason I'd say they would do it is, as you sort of said, the checking of the marketing box, making sure that they're competitive on those features, and that's really it. If they do have high-end cards in the future, they probably will need to go down the multi-frame gen path, especially if Nvidia continues to improve the quality to reduce some of those issues with image quality from frame gen. And if they can fix that latency hurdle, which is very problematic and is probably very difficult to solve, then they will probably start needing to invest some time and effort into it.
You mentioned it. Endless Logins writes in, Tim, do you think Radeon is ready for the next GPU generation to go for the high end again? Or do you think they will top out with mid-range yet again?
Yeah, I guess, is this question talking about the future generations or the current?
Next gen, yeah.
Right, yeah, because we said in a recent Q&A about how difficult it would be, I think, for AMD to have created a high-end GPU this generation just based on what they've got, die sizes, performance, where their features are at. I think the main thing that sort of would limit AMD for a future generation going for the high-end is how gamers buying high-end cards want the best. And so you need to be competitive on pretty much everything to produce a card that's the best and that people would want to buy. And there's many ways that they could do that. If they had a really much more powerful card in terms of performance, then maybe it wouldn't be as crucial that they don't have the CUDA support or the, FSR in as many games or whatever. But I think what would hold them back from, at least right now, from having like what would it be, like a 9080 XT or XTX or whatever,
Probably.
or 1990, would be that, first of all, they probably couldn't get the performance that much higher than a 5090. It would probably be around that or slower. And then secondly, they would have, all that feature issues. Like, is the ray tracing performance going to be good enough to compete at the high end? Is FSR4 going to be in enough games? Do they have all the software features, the RTX HDR, all that sort of thing, the CUDA support, the AI support, the ecosystem? They have a really good feature set at the moment, I think, AMD, for competing at the entry level and mid-range, because those gamers are more concerned about the core features, which would be the performance. Ray tracing is kind of important for mid-range at the moment. Then upscaling is pretty good. You got your video encoding, pretty good. Those are the features that people use, maybe a bit of frame gen, they've got that. But then, at the high end, it's about everything. And so maybe in 2 years, 3 years, hopefully it's not 3 years, 2 years, when the next GPU generation is ready, they will be able to have the feature set. They've improved the game support for things like FSR. They're working on the competitiveness for all the other aspects. So then they have this GPU they can release that's competitive on performance, competitive on features, and would entice people that want the best card to buy something that's the best. I think in the past they've been in this position where their high-end GPUs, they're priced lower than Nvidia's best GPU, but they're still very expensive. Do they have all the components necessary to justify that sort of card? I'm thinking of like a 6900 XT sort of product. Not as fast as Nvidia's best products, doesn't have as many features. It is priced lower. So, competitively, you're sort of looking at it. For some areas, it's competitive. But then I think when gamers are talking about, or gamers are spending money above that sort of $800, $1,000 range, the price and the value is sort of irrelevant in some areas. People just spend the money they need to get the best.
Unless you're very bad with money, I'd really hope if you can afford a $1,200 GPU, you can afford a $2,000. Or why are you spending over $1,000?
Like I think $1,000 to $2,000 is probably... You could make some arguments that people who can spend $1,000 may not be able to spend $2,000, because that's a really large difference. But in the past, it's been, the 4080 was $1,200, the 4090 was $1,600. That's kind of like $1,200. You may as well just buy the 4090, right? Especially because it was a lot more powerful. These days, it's like I could see people going for a 5080 because the 5090 is just so much more expensive, and it is a lot more powerful with availability, all that sort of thing. So I think Radeon, this generation, bit of a reset for Radeon. Target the things they can target and get right. Make sure you nail the launch. Figure out how to do a launch, because you kind of need to nail a launch to nail a high-end GPU launch. So figure that out, figure out the value, make sure the hardware is good, setting you up for the future. So obviously good to see the improvements in ray tracing, AI, that's setting them up for future generations. Features, improved a lot of those things, setting those things up for success in the future. So again, like game support, in 2 years, I'm expecting FSR 4 to be in a lot more games than it's in now, and that will be less of an issue. Today, sure, big gap. You might consider Nvidia because of that. Next generation, who knows where things are going to be. So I think AMD's real challenge for the next gen is probably going to be more things like anticipating what Nvidia's got in the bag, like how are they going to compete with Nvidia's next features and not have those features come out 1 or 2 years later. Or alternatively, the thing I've been talking about and banging on for a long time is what is the Radeon exclusive feature? If they can come out with a high-end GPU with some sort of exclusive Radeon feature that's not seen before, it's not just competing with Nvidia, then I think they'll have a real shot at the high end. Because, theoretically, you can see how scaling could go, that they're not that far behind in the performance side of things, that it's unrealistic that, like RDNA 4 probably could be scaled up to a 5090 level of performance. It just would be very expensive. Yeah. The die would be huge, and there's a whole range of issues competitively. But for the future, I think it's probably possible.
Yeah, and I haven't really followed up on this because until, this is my opinion, until I get more sources confirming what I've heard from a couple about some Navi 48 Ultimate, I wouldn't want to say anything that specific publicly, because this is the sort of thing where I would think fanboys might get a bit emotional if it turned out to be incorrect that AMD isn't competing at the tier I've heard they might be aiming for. But I think were they to be able to make some special variant of Navi 48, perform a tier or two higher, that would be a good bellwether for, do they buy it? Like, if we make a $1,000 card, do gamers buy it this time? And if they don't, they'll go, well, they didn't buy it at 1,000. I don't think they're going to buy it at 2,000. And then if that goes well, I would agree that they also do probably need something. They need some feature that's easy to market. So whatever it's called, the 10, they're probably going to have to reset their naming scheme again, right? Unless they're going to go 10900 XT. I don't even know next time. Like, that won't really work unless they've proven they can already make a high-end card this gen and they have a new feature. Because I don't see why, even if maybe it would sell well, I also don't know why management would feel safe launching that if they're like, every time we've tried, it's failed.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether they need a trial run or not. I think they could release a card. I mean, there's always a market for like your special edition, limited edition stuff. I don't know whether that would justify making a whole new large GPU die, make it bigger, make it better, only to sell it as like a limited edition thing for AMD fans.
I don't mean a larger die, though.
Oh, you mean like more of just an overclocked version of what they've got, or something along those lines, or a 32 gig version,
or some tweaked variant that like has a couple new features. Yeah, like, but not a larger die. I think they would lose with a larger die because the whole thing they have right now is supply, and don't get in the way of making a lot of mid-range cards.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't think a larger die would necessarily work, but yeah, like a 32 gig version with additional features and maybe a bit of an overclock would probably work. But yeah, I think for the future, I honestly don't think AMD needs any sort of trial run. They just need to prove that what they're producing is compelling to gamers. So if gamers have a good perception of Radeon cards, which they haven't had in the past, then I think people would be willing to try a high-end card next time. Again, they'd have to prove, once the card is produced, they still have to make sure it's competitive in performance, value, features, all those sorts of things. They can't just make any sort of high-end card and expect it to sell. They have to make it good. But I think, the sentiment from GeForce last couple of generations has been not great. Gamers are being, you see just the feedback from the launches of things is not good. Gamers very much complaining about the pricing, the lack of supply for this generation, the making each tier more expensive each time. Gamers want something different. They want to feel like these companies are listening to gamers and what they're giving them what they want. And so if AMD does that this generation, improves some of their brand image, people have a good perception of Radeon, there's none of this talk of like, are they going to stuff up the launch yet again? then they'll be in a better position to just launch cold a new high-end card. You probably wouldn't want to launch it first. You probably want to, again, establish we're doing, again, a nice, good mid-range. Then you bring out the surprise, right? We've got a high-end card. Here it is. And, people have been supportive of our cards previously. Now we've got something for the high-end market as well, and just see how it goes. With these things, it always takes multiple generations to bring back, get into a better position. So if they keep executing, there's no reason why they couldn't have, high-end cards.
This piece of content is brought to you by the minis for BD 795i and 790i SE motherboards. This motherboard, specifically the 795i, is amazing. For less than the price of a single 7950X, this motherboard includes a 16-core 5.4 gigahertz Zen 4 processor, the cooler for cooling it, a Wi-Fi card, and support for 2 Gen 5 NVMe SSDs. And again, this is also with the motherboard. So think about that. You're getting the motherboard, the CPU, the Wi-Fi, and the cooler for less than the price of a roughly equivalent CPU alone. This is an insane deal. Seriously, Dan, co-host of Broken Silicon, is now using this in his main system, and I'm actually considering using it in my main system as well, upgrading from Zen 3 and maybe saving money after I sell off my parts, because this is just a fantastic budget platform. It is my go-to recommendation for most people building a new PC. And so, look, if you are interested and you want to support this channel, click on the link in the description and make sure you utilize any bonus codes provided down there to get the best price on this product. Support Moore's Law is Dead by checking out the minis from BD 795i and 790i SE motherboards today. Sad XTX 999 writes in and says, AMD recently came out and said that the 9070 series has sold 10 times more than its predecessors in the first week, and sentiment seems to be changing even in casual places. Is the train finally leaving the station for market share for Radeon, or is it all for naught once Nvidia decides to come back after the AI bubble and masses flock back to the leather jacket man? Despite all the problems going on with Blackwell, I'm still concerned that people will just default to Nvidia regardless of the prices if supply returns on the Nvidia side. So, yeah, I mean, do you think real mindshare damage is being done here to Nvidia this gen?
Yeah, I don't think so for the casual audience. So we're talking like not people watching hardware unbox videos. We're talking people, buying gaming laptops pre-built, just first-time gaming PC sort of thing. I think the very casual audience is still very geared towards Nvidia being the dominant brand. And so it's always questionable, like how much is it filtering down to those people that GPUs are extremely expensive? Is the messaging getting through about GPUs are just expensive now, accept it? And then beyond that, you've got, the whole frame generation makes cards better performing than they really do. Is that working for casual audience? I don't know. I'm not as in tune with those people. So I think you'd still see a lot of people just default to GeForce. But the way it works, the way you build that mindshare, you convince the casual audience, and the way it's worked with things like Ryzen, right, is you have to convince the enthusiasts first, the people that, set the opinion, the people that are recommending things to casual people, because, you got the casual audience, right? Who do they go to for their recommendations? They probably just ask their mate that is like the most into PC gaming. My cousin
gives me a call. Yeah.
Right. So if those people can be convinced, then it starts to flood down to the other people. And so I think at least what we're seeing from, you look on Reddit, other people's videos, our videos, comments, the feedback from launches, those sorts of things, is a lot of complaints about what GeForce is doing, what NVIDIA is doing with their cards, especially relating to how expensive they are. I think from a technical perspective, people aren't, they're not complaining about how powerful a 5090 is. Maybe, it's not as fast as, the 5090 was versus the 3090. It's not as fast compared to a 4090. Okay. But the majority of the complaints are things like, is NVIDIA really serving me as a gamer? These cards, they don't have enough VRAM for me at the entry level. They're so expensive. Each of the series that I used to buy, like I used to be a 70 series buyer. Now those cards that used to be $400 now $600. So what's going on there? Or they're $550 now.
Well, they're like 800 to 1,000 actually.
Yes. How can I buy a card? Like, are NVIDIA actually concerned about supplying me a GPU at a reasonable price? Or are they just manipulating the market, selling them to AI? Not really concerned about gamers. And I think you could maybe get away with that with one generation, like the 40 series. People complained massively about the 4080 12 gigabyte and all that sort of thing. But when it gets to a second generation and another disappointment, you'll probably see for the 60 series that there's less excitement, less interest in people. People are probably going to come out and do what they've done for Radeon for the last couple of generations. With Radeon, it was, can they launch a GPU properly? Which really wasn't an issue a couple of generations ago. They launched cards. No one was really complaining about that. A couple of generations later, that's the issue. I think for Nvidia will be the pricing. Are they going to make their cards disgustingly expensive and not available again? And so that will certainly hurt. I think has been hurting their brand as much as they've been trying to do, all this marketing and stuff. And again, like the propaganda as well, that hurts their marketing too, because how many times you can do that once and maybe get away with it. People will sort of be like, okay, interesting claims. Let's see how they stack up. Not anymore. People have access to FrameGen. They know what it does. They can test these features. They're using it themselves. They know exactly what is and isn't a FrameGen experience versus a non-FrameGen experience. They know the marketing claims are going to be BS the next time around. I think people will be, especially enthusiasts, in less of a position to buy that. So they're not going to be sitting there going, 5070 equals 4090. Not going to buy that next time. Not going to work. People will be well attuned to that. It's been multiple generations of trying that. Not going to work. So I think they're in a real position where, GeForce is probably going to be having to, they're still going to get tons of sales. So whatever I'm saying here, it's not like it's going to impact their sales all that much. But I think it's just going to be bringing gamers into a position where they're more accepting of an alternate option. Whereas previously, if NVIDIA nailed this launch, like if the 50 series went off super well, great prices, great availability, look how good DLSS 4 is. You don't really even have to talk about multi-frame gen because the upscaling quality of DLSS 4 is excellent. So just focus on that. If that was going down, then it would be much harder for AMD to come in and offer their experience. They're doing things for gamers because NVIDIA is doing things for gamers. But NVIDIA is not really doing things for gamers. That opens the door for this AMD to sell many more cards than their predecessors, to be, train leaving the station for market shares. The question sort of put it. I think, are they going to get huge amounts of market share from this generation? Probably not. But they're going to be putting themselves in a position where the Radeon brand goes from being this sort of the dunce. People don't care about it. They talk about it largely negatively. People make fun of it. Like the whole thing about the launches, people are making fun of AMD for being unable to launch GPUs. How AMD never takes misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity or whatever. All those sorts of things. They're being laughed at. And so they need to change that. And I think they've gotten the biggest opportunity ever to change that, make so that people aren't laughing at AMD anymore about the quality of the Radeon team. So if they can, I think, the 9070 has been a pretty good success in that sense. That are people laughing about the 9070 XT's launch anymore? Probably not. They're complaining about lack of supply, but they're not going, Radeon botched it again and these cards are bad and have bad features and not competitive. People want to buy them. That's why they're not available. They're flying off shelves. So if they can maintain that sentiment through the rest of the generation, nail the launches of the lower tier models, do what gamers want, then they'll have good momentum into the next generation for the first time in many years. And that is what's going to build market share for future generations. They just need people to feel like a Radeon card is something that's worth owning. And if GeForce continues to be in this position where they're not really giving gamers what they want, they're making cards more expensive, then gamers are going to be primed to choose an alternate option. And the same applies to Intel. Like the B580 could have flown off shelves if it was available at the price that it was advertised for and supply was really strong. Gamers had a great reception to that card at launch. People were excited after the presentation, excited after the reviews. And we're talking about a brand that was absolutely nowhere, like even more nowhere than Radeon. And they just completely fumbled it because you can't buy one. So I think that and what we're seeing from Radeon shows that gamers are in more of a position to try alternate versions than they've been for a few years.
Yeah, I think one of the best decisions AMD made for the 9070 XT reveal was just saying standard clock speed models are actually 2% weaker than the 5070 Ti. Overclock models are 2% faster, giving you complete, fair, a fairly portraying their cards. the exact opposite of, I think, one of the biggest mistakes AMD ever made in their, or Radeon, I should say, ever made in their history, is the ridiculous marketing for RDNA 3 that was, it wasn't 20% off because of the game. It was like 40% off from the actual performance and the damage
Mhm.
that did. And I just remember seeing that in my videos too, because it affects me a lot because like I leak a lot of stuff and it was very easy to leak like Zen 4 in gaming can be 20 to 30% faster than Zen 3. And people would believe me because AMD is internal. They didn't lie about Zen 2 or Zen 3 or eventually Zen 4. I think they really sandbagged. And then after that RDNA 3 thing, it didn't matter. Like, even though like some of the stuff I would leak was like, well, this is internal testing. I mean, why would they lie to themselves? But that time they lied to gamers did so much damage. And I do wonder, like you're saying, it's a really interesting thought of like, even if this 1690 is awesome, how many times is Nvidia going to say 2 to 4 times faster? And gamers go, all right, who knows? It could be twice as fast or 10% faster. We have no clue. And I wonder if Nvidia's underestimating how much damage they've done because they've really messed with their fans. I mean, Turing was so expensive, DLSS 1 was terrible. They really messed with supply with Ampere, and frankly, I'd say just outright lied about the price of their cards. I mean, the 3060 didn't go to MSRP until like 3 years after it was out. I don't, and then you have Lovelace really expensive, Blackwell. I mean, the issues go on, and I think it will be very interesting to see how people react to the reveal for what Finan, or I don't know what it is, whatever they call the next generation, because I really do suspect everyone's going to like you can see when someone's built up a good track record because like the reveal on the AMD or an Nvidia YouTube channel will have more people in the live stream because they actually want to see what they say live because they
Yeah.
think it might end up being that good, you know.
I think enthusiasts, you know, this crowd that we've got on Hardware Unboxed, your channel, all these sorts of channels and places. First of all, it's big. Like the DIY market is big, right? So, and those are people who are in tune to these sorts of things. And secondly, they have great BS detectors. The work that we've been putting in, you know, across all the independent media for years now, ever since the start of PC gaming, from magazines into the written stuff into YouTube channels, has, I feel, built up BS detectors in the
Mm.
audience more so than you would see for a lot of other industries and products. You know, I don't know. I always use like the vacuum cleaner example. Like, do people have BS detectors when going to buy a
No,
vacuum cleaner and are fans of vacuum
not
cleaners?
a lot of vacuum cleaner leaker and reviewer channels. Yeah.
Yeah, probably not. And there are some great people testing, reviewing vacuum cleaners, but it's more of a sort of casual audience. Whereas for this sort of audience, and I've almost seen this comment in sort of like a negative way from mainstream gaming crowds, where it's sort of like PC gamers, they always complaining they don't put up with BS sort of thing. I think that's great because if you don't put up with
Yeah.
BS, then you end up getting better quality outcomes at the end of the day. Like, I think that's when I see those complaints, it's largely related to, PC gamers, they're so entitled, they don't want to deal with stuttering in games or want to deal with XYZ feature that, console gamers, you can't even run at 4K 140 FPS, and now suddenly PC gamers are complaining they can't do that. It's like, okay, but I think, that's what's been built up in this community. And so, you're talking about like the RDNA 3 launch lying about the performance or at least being misleading. They did a whole bunch of other weird things like talking up VRAM and then releasing cards without adequate
Hmm.
VRAM. Your games have memories, they have BS detectors. This audience just doesn't fall for that sort of thing, and they have long memories too. So they remember times when you make some pretty weird marketing claims or misleading marketing claims, and come in with that BS detector fully engaged for the next time that claims are being made. And so, you sort of pointed this out as well. The difference between the CPU marketing and the GPU marketing. The CPU marketing, people generally believed that, so they had some goodwill. Maybe they eroded that a bit with Zen 5, but maybe they recovered that with the X3D models.
Hmm.
But people generally, when the slides came out, go, okay, this looks pretty good. With Radeon, it was all like, oh, how real is that? What are they emitting from this information? And the other issue that AMD's had is that they can do all the, accurate marketing, the doing things for gamers that they want. But if at the end of the day, they still have a product that is in many ways inferior to what GeForce is doing in key areas, then that's going to be really difficult for them to build any sort of mindshare. Like, even if they came out and they said RDNA 3 was exactly what it was, they advertised the performance accurately, launched them without some blunders and did all that sort of thing. Ultimately, the performance of the cards probably would have let them down for things like ray tracing. The upscaling quality would have let them down. That's what the product was. And so I feel like a lot of gamers were sort of going, okay, we're not happy with the 40 series launch, really upset about the pricing of the 4080, the unlaunching, bit of a disaster, 4060 Ti, bit of a disaster with the 8 and 16 gig card. But what's my alternative? Well, my alternative is a Radeon card that is even worse on the hardware front, has lackluster upscaling. So I'm kind of choosing between two bad choices. I either go with the overpriced GeForce GPU that's not really giving me what I want from VRAM or other things, or I go with the Radeon card, which isn't giving me what I want from upscaling and ray tracing or other features. Whereas that's very different this generation with the improvements that AMD has made. And if they continue to do that and continue to go down that path, then GeForce, they'll find it very much harder than they have in terms of delivering that sort of propaganda messaging, because gamers sort of go, okay, yeah, those performance slides, the enthusiast crowd at least goes, okay, I'm not really buying that, but we'll see what it's like. Hopefully the baseline performance is still good. All the feature quality, we know some of those features are good, so I'll be in a good position to buy those cards. Is that BS detector going to be sounding off in a different way when AMD launches products that are potentially got the features that people want? There's better sentiment towards the Radeon brand. I think that'll the BS will hit harder from the GeForce side of things in terms of how much people are willing to accept what they're saying. I think that'll be more of a challenge for Nvidia next time around, because really, RDNA 3 era, they probably could have said whatever they wanted to say, and they probably would have sold just as well. I don't think that'll apply next time around.
No, yeah, I agree. The degree to which that matters, I think, is just from a nerd who watches this space perspective going to be really interesting to see, because, and I do keep saying this to people, like, I know there's this black pill sentiment out there. It doesn't matter what we do to idiots, we'll just buy it anyways. But I think there's been a lot of evidence lately that's not true. The 4080 sold pretty well, worse than 80 series it's ever sold. The 4070 didn't sell well into its life. I mean, you're seeing the 5090 start to come in stock at $3,000. People aren't buying it. I think I'm seeing more and more evidence that we are reaching the limits of what gamers will put up with when it comes to pricing and messing with supply stuff. Like, it's unheard of to think of an 80 series card not selling out. The 4080 didn't. That to me was like, oh, so it is possible for people to not buy the first thing that launches. And I think anyone who's like really pessimistic about that just needs to look at, there's been several unprecedented failures from Nvidia recently. They unlaunched the 4080 12 gigabyte. I don't remember a time in history where they've done that.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a few generations for that to have any large impact. So when we're talking about can Radeon improve market share, we're not saying like they're going to go from 5% to 50% within a generation doing this. But, as we've seen from the Ryzen, and Ryzen was in a similar sort of place, because back when Intel was producing graphics cards, not graphics cards, CPUs, right? Were they doing what gamers really wanted? I mean, they made each CPU a little bit faster, sort of kept the core count the same. There was a lot of feeling of like, the Skylake stagnation era, that sort of thing. Gamers were in a position, the enthusiast PC builders were in a position where they were willing to try out an alternate brand that had a poor reception, was kind of nowhere, because the alternate wasn't doing what they wanted. They wanted more from each CPU, weren't getting that. So what are they primed? They're primed for low-cost Ryzen CPUs. They'll give it a chance. So I don't think it's ever been a position where gamers are not willing to give alternate products or other things a chance. They will, if it's good enough. I think the issue has been the AMD fumbling things over and over again to hurt their perception. So gamers sort of less willing to try things because, the perception isn't there. They sort of got this, I don't know, lack of a better word, kind of like stinky brand. Like, do I really want to try that? And then just the quality of the products was lackluster. I think that AMD underestimated how necessary it was to have good quality features throughout that generation. They had the raster performance, and that's pretty much where it ended for RDNA 3.
Anthony White writes in, touching on some of the stuff you're bringing up here, and says, "Hey, Tim Tom, I know Tim is no longer a laptop reviewer, but can we compare AMD's current laptop roadmap with Intel's offerings in the past? Tom's most recent video indicated a 6 to 9 month cadence for laptops. It's not really that I indicated it. I've just noticed that they seem to have Hawk points, Strix Halo, like what, Medusa stuff coming. It seems like AMD is really putting out multiple APU upgrades every year." He says, "I don't know if Intel ever did the same. When Intel was dominant in laptop, why weren't they more aggressive?"
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's probably resting on their laurels a bit, right? Like Intel is absolutely dominant in laptops, so pretty much just do whatever, right? Release them at the same time every year, and I think that probably helps out some of the OEM customers as well, who like their, let's release a laptop every year. This chips come out at the exact same time. They're aligning with our schedules, and so we always have that big push around the holiday or back
Yes,
to
I
school
heard that
era.
from some OEMs that they actually liked how predictable it was.
Yeah, so that's sort of the reasoning we've heard about, why does Intel refresh the exact same CPU into like 12th to 13th gen or 13th to 14th gen or whatever? Very similar. Why do they do that? Why don't they just keep the chips on the market for a longer period of time? It's because those major customers want their next generation desktops or laptops to have a new chip in it to match the next generation. So they can say, oh, look, the previous gen had the 13900K, the new generation is the 14900K, therefore it must be better, right? So Intel serves those customers, and I think that's probably why they've done what they're doing, whereas AMD is in a very different position, right? For laptops, they need to convince OEMs and to just use their chips. So they need to just pump out whenever the chips are ready, pump them out, convince the market that the chips are good, and then hopefully they can start getting into that sort of cadence where they can release at a fairly standard, time frame, I guess, where that OEM customers
You're seeing
want.
it with their desktop, right? Their desktop CPUs. It's a very predictable 2 years now.
Yeah, so I would expect that, for the laptop market, like I said, AMD is kind of, it's weird. They haven't had non-competitive products. They've had some supply issues, it seems, like the demand's maybe been more than they've expected for some generations. As the questions allude to, I don't really follow the laptop market too much anymore. But the strategy they're going with pumping out everything and anything when they can, that's pretty much what you'd want to do. You can't just leave like a good chip that is going to be successful waiting for the next time a laptop manufacturer may be willing to put it in your products, because that's time that you're losing. It allows your competitors to come back with a better quality product that's more competitive. So it seems like their strategy is, let's get the best quality chips we can in a limited number of products initially so that we can get the word out there, and then hopefully things come from there. They seem to have some reasonably good partnerships with companies like ASUS for that at the moment, that are producing these high quality competitive products. And then hopefully, they need to build up their market share in that area, and that seems to be what they're at least attempting to do.
So I do want to get your opinion, because I really am curious. Like, I recently put out this leak last week. The information I got blew me away. I have documents showing that AMD is moving to not from 4 nanometer on Zen 5 to 3 nanometer, but supposedly for the top desktop chips, N2X. So not even just 2 nanometer, but like the fastest 2 nanometer, the most bleeding edge thing they can get, pushing above 6 gigahertz, 24 cores. They can now stack Vcache as well, so you can do multiple layers of it. I haven't been told they're going to do that for consumer products, so I don't think people should assume they will next gen, but they can do it. And when you add that all up, even here, they may even put RDNA 4 integrated chip iGPUs on some of their desktop parts as well. It really seems like they're just going all in, like 3 nanometer IO die for some products, 24 cores, above 6 gigahertz with Vcache. I'm wondering just what your thoughts on that in general are. I don't know that I even have a specific question, because you could answer any facet of this, like finally going above 16 cores. The fact that AMD doesn't seem to be playing it safe with the node this time. They're taking an almost Apple-like approach of what is the best thing we can buy, give it to us as soon as possible. Yeah, I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm just going off the sort of slide that you've provided. So that's for the next part of this question. I think, when would this chip have been largely designed and developed and sort of some of these strategies put into place. You're talking about a couple of years
Like
prior to now.
3 years ago. Yeah, probably.
So, AMD's probably predicting Intel is not going to be stagnating as much anymore. They're probably seeing, movements in their process node technology, movements in their design architecture, all that sort of thing. And so it makes sense that AMD would be thinking for Zen 6 and future products that they can't just play it safe with some of these things, and that to be competitive, they probably will have to go all out in these areas. And I don't know. I don't know whether AMD internally would think what they have thought of Arrow Lake, for example, whether they thought it's been disappointing, better than they
I
expected.
think they expected a lot more out of it. I think they expected a lot more.
But certainly if they were expecting it to be a lot better than it was, then they would be needing to do things like increase the core count, really go hard on improving the I/O die, which I think is a pretty significant bottleneck with Zen 5, improving the process technology, which is really how they're going to be able to get, more dense CPU cores and things and target those IPC gains. So, and again, they set up some of those things with the architecture of Zen 5, which is on the same process node, a very similar process node, by improving all that AVX 512 stuff, improving some of those things which really weren't going to impact consumer workloads, but may start impacting consumer workloads in 2 or 4 years or whenever. So, yeah, it would make sense that they're going for a lot of these things. I think the if you're looking at multi-threaded productivity workloads on desktop, then they're kind of at the limits of where 16 cores can go competitively. Like, that's the area where Arrow Lake is the most competitive, is multi-thread productivity, especially across the lineup. Like the mid-range, the lower products are very competitive in terms of their performance in that area. So unless they had like a huge IPC gain on 16 cores and they're thinking about how are we going to compete with the future Intel product, what would make sense? Increasing the core count. And if they go with a more dense process node and all that sort of thing, it would enable them to do that a bit easier on the same sort of package. So that would make sense. I don't know whether they'll end up doing the TSMC N2 or N3. Not sure. You're suggesting it's N2.
All of the above, honestly, that they'll use a lot of different nodes. But there was one document that specifically, which I'd be happy to share with you, that specifically said insufficient, must get above 6 gigahertz this time. So to me, it seems like a very opposite approach to how they've acted in the past, where they're like, what can we do? Let's cost optimize it. This is the best we can do for the price. And this time they're like, it almost feels like there's a mandate to win in a way I haven't seen before. Like, they've gotten lucky in the past, right? Like Zen 3 beating Rocket Lake. I don't think they expected to. I think they got lucky.
Yeah, and I mean, this generation they're winning. So it's kind of like, yeah, the point that you make about shifting from the cost optimizing to the performance optimizing, again, would make a lot of sense. If they're in that position where they've moved from the success that they're seeing being largely those cost optimized products, the Ryzen 5s, that sort of thing for gamers, the 16 core's been sort of successful for the high-end productivity users, but they're starting to see more and more of those wins. Like, people are buying predominantly high-end CPUs. Like the 9800 XT has probably been their most successful high-end CPU ever. Flown off shelves, was hard to buy for months. So if they again, these CPUs were designed before they would have got that feedback from products, so that has to be factored into this. But it would make sense. If they think they're going to be in a leadership position with the current generation, then it would make sense to go, well, if we can make high-end products and start making tons of money from them, let's do that. And it's based on what you're saying, seems to be the path that they're going. But I mean, some of these things that you've suggested in these slides wouldn't be overly surprising to me. It would make a lot of sense for them to be targeting
2 years away, right?
Targeting, yeah.
Everyone needs to keep that in mind too. Is it's like, that sounds crazy. It's like, just remember, this is not happening tomorrow. A thought I have too is you mentioned, like, it's a really good point. Like, well, when would they have made this decision? I remember a couple of years ago, all of these rumors coming out about the Intel rentable units and Jim Keller's program, and Intel's going to redefine cores. From what it sounds like now, Intel has canceled those projects. I guess we'll see if they come out. But if you're AMD, they would probably have also been sitting there going, oh, Intel's next Sandy Bridge might come out in 2026. We might want to be ready for that. And so let's just make sure we don't hold back anything to compete with that.
Yeah, and they'd be thinking about, if that doesn't pan out, then something like a refined Arrow Lake where, Arrow Lake was supposed to be this big architectural change, improving efficiency and
It
all those sorts of
was.
things. So, I mean, it improved some
It was a
areas. So,
change, but I don't know if it did what it wanted to.
yeah, but if they're thinking like, well, if Arrow Lake's a first generation product, then usually it's when you start getting to the second, third generations that they really start hitting their straps. And so, and on top of that, Intel has been making some very bold claims about their 18A process node, their future process technologies. And so if all those things start compounding and making Intel CPUs much more competitive, then they can't just sit around and be making products that don't target the best of the best. So, yeah.
Gian Violi writes in and says, "Hi, Tom and Tim. With the recent leak that Medusa Hail will be launching most likely in the second half of 27, how do you see the high-end APU market playing out if Nvidia is able to get a decent APU out in 2026? I don't know how closely you followed that too, that Nvidia is working on APUs. To be honest, I've heard mixed things about how that's going. I was a little more optimistic half a year ago, but again, I don't really know for sure. But I wonder what you think about an opportunity for Nvidia to enter the market, at least when Intel's kind of floundering there."
Yeah, like you sort of alluded to, I don't follow that super closely. I mean, I've heard the rumors of Nvidia working on CPUs like ARM-based CPUs that they could use for this sort of project. And honestly, it'd make a lot of sense. They make some CPU products for servers, and they've made CPUs in the past for various different, SoCs, mainly for things like the Nintendo Switch, for example, but other sort of, they used to have tablets, for example, Android tablets way back in the day that used NVIDIA Tegra stuff. So they've done it in the past, right? It'd make a lot of sense for NVIDIA to do that, really. They've got the leading GPU architecture and IP. So if they can bring up the CPU side of things, it's kind of like AMD bringing up the GPU side of things for their APUs. So they should at some point, really, if they wanted to get back into gaming, which maybe they don't care too much about these days with the AI side of things, maybe their plans would change because they're suddenly making tons of money from AI. But it would make a lot of sense for NVIDIA to try go down the ARM path, make some sort of APU product, and then obviously AMD competing with that. They're sort of working towards this, aren't they, with their improving their CPU technology generation over generation, improving the GPU technology, making both of those things high-end, world-class sort of products. Eventually, surely it would come to the position where they're starting to make extremely compelling APU products. And it seems to be, there's been good reception for the current generation stuff, compelling performance, that sort of thing in an iGPU. So if they can continue executing on that, then it should be a pretty compelling sort of market. And really for laptop products, surely we should be moving more into large APUs as opposed to the split chip thing that we've seen previously, especially as improvements with tiling or multi-die designs and fabrics to connect them all together. That seems to be the future, I would have thought.
Well, yeah, and you look at, if you're NVIDIA, I'd say there's two big reasons to do this. I mean, number one, you already win APU, you already win GPU. Come on, what's left? CPU. But also, I think there's like a real risk here. Like AMD is making better and better GPUs, I mean APUs, I should say. It's conceivable the one that comes next. I mean, they're kind of just below a 5070 now. What if the next one is up to like a 5080 and you don't even have the next generation out? Like, are you going to let AMD have this opportunity where they can just make the argument you don't want an NVIDIA laptop because it's just worse? Because you don't want two chips, they're less reliable, driver issues, they have half the battery life, and not have your own answer to it. I think it would be just like a huge weakness to not have an answer to potentially AMD hitting the market with stronger and stronger APUs that get all the way up, maybe even to your high-end GPUs by then.
Yeah, and they'd be benefiting from Microsoft trying to get their act together on ARM on Windows. Obviously, they want to compete with Apple's laptop chips as well, which have these huge designs, big
Enormous.
APUs, big GPUs. So NVIDIA's probably wanting to get have their fingers in that sort of pie. And then we're seeing as well like the growth of handheld gaming as a sort of market. And the Switch 2 is just about to come out. The Switch has been very successful. But then in addition to that, Steam Deck and all the Steam Deck sort of derivative products, definitely a growing market. And while NVIDIA may not care too much about gaming anymore, maybe not care enough to create products in that market segment, if handheld gaming continues to be growing in that segment for PC gaming, they definitely want to have a product in there they can't just have, consoles at AMD, have these handheld gaming devices be AMD, all the APUs be AMD, because AMD clearly benefits from having APU style products in these things for game developers to work towards. Like the consoles have been such a huge thing for AMD to make sure that games are optimized for AMD GPU hardware and all that sort of thing. So Nvidia would probably want to have some sort of product to compete with that sort of thing. And maybe that would make the console market competitive in a few generations, which we're probably talking like 15 years from now. But, like at
Mm-hmm.
some point, if they had the CPU and GPU architectures to create those sorts of products, they could, offer some sort of solution for them. There's all sorts of things that they'd probably be wanting to get into. But like I said, AI products are dominating everything for Nvidia at the moment. Their CPU development is probably largely focused on servers. So whether that's applicable to things that they don't care as much about, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think too when it comes to like Nvidia getting aggressive in graphics again, I keep thinking, the AI bubble is going to have to pop, honestly, for them to truly take the market share they have in graphics seriously. I don't think they're just going to let AMD Radeon, take the market from GeForce, but I can't see them having like Pascal like GPU launches unless they have to, because AI goes into a downturn.
Yeah. Yeah, no idea about that. Like, again, the AI thing, it's probably you could talk for hours based on that. But yeah, I mean, I think NVIDIA still needs to keep their fingers in that GPU market just because if something happens to AI, it doesn't go quite the way that they've been predicting, or companies can't get the return on investment from AI, which is probably the biggest concern I would have as sort of an outsider looking in, seeing what's happening in AI. I don't follow it that closely, so you're probably better off listening to actual experts on that about the AI thing. But to me, they're investing tons, companies are investing tons of money into AI. Are they going to be able to make that money back? If not, Nvidia is going to be in a bit of trouble because investment into GPU servers will slow down. And if that slows down, then they're going to need to have some backups in terms of continuing to make money. And GeForce Gaming has been pretty consistent over the years. It's growing. It still is growing. They're making more billions every year, but they need some sort of backup, right? So they need to keep that consistent, steady supply of GeForce. If they have to rely on it, they can't neglect it, basically. So, yeah, I think it would be very silly for them to just, just focus on AI products, just in case something happens in that market. But again, they're obviously predicting something very different, that line continued to go up. So who knows?
Yeah. All right. I think we've already touched on monitors a bit. So I actually think I want the final question here. It's a pretty interesting one to end on, I believe. Gian Fioli writes in and says, "Hi, Tom and Tim. What is the biggest opportunity in the market that you see yet to be fulfilled by each major player?" And I guess you don't have to go through all of them, but I think this is an interesting question. Like, what's the big, and the way I take this, AMD slash Radeon, Intel, Nvidia, maybe even mention a console or Apple or whoever you want. But like, what is the most blindingly obvious, in your opinion, opportunities that these players have missed in the past or that you think are missing now or in the future?
Yeah, I mean, if I had the answers to this right, I think I could become a
Sure.
consultant and make millions of dollars. So I think on the CPU, if we start on the CPU market, I think there's probably not that much that I could think of. I think the CPU market has been serving pretty much every aspect really well at the moment, from like a desktop DIY sort of side. I think the X3D parts have been really impressive for gamers and really added a lot of gaming performance over the last couple of years, which is really what people want, right? Like just more gaming performance. And now we're starting to see things with like the 9950 X3D, right? That's what it's called.
Hmm.
9950 X3D. They've solved some of those issues with the scheduling and that sort of thing, which allows them to have this one product does all sort of thing, which previously I would have said would have been a gap, right? For people that have that dual use situation, you've kind of do compromise the gaming experience a little bit with the 7950 X3D versus the top tier products.
Hmm.
Seems to be less of a problem now. So, if I'm looking at the CPU market, we've got good affordable products on last gen and current gen platforms. We've got really good productivity performance with the high core count models. We've got a good mixture of performance if you want gaming and that, and we've got really good gaming performance. So, I mean, what more could you want, really? Like all market segments are really being taken care of. Obviously, my concern there would be the lack of competitiveness from Intel has the potential for AMD to become a monopoly in the future. So that's something we'd have to keep a watch on. But for now, the products that we've got are not unreasonably priced or seem to be in that sort of monopoly position. So if that continues, then I think we'll be in a pretty good position. For the GPU market, it seems like it's pretty much the complete opposite, right? Like we've gone through years now of really bizarre decision making, especially from the minor players like AMD and Intel, where they just don't seem to be all that concerned about doing things that gamers would want. So if we're talking about like opportunities in the market for graphics, it's just purely listen to the gamers, listen to what they want, because that's where all the opportunities are. Like AMD missed the biggest trick with RDNA 3 by not listening as much to what gamers would want in terms of, you go back to the RX 7600, the configuration of that, just poor pricing, 8 gigabytes for that product made little sense when they could have made it 16 gig, made it much more competitive. Those are the sorts of opportunities that I'm seeing, and it's largely on a company like AMD, because I imagine GeForce will continue to do what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're talking like, what are the easiest paths in? Well, make GPUs affordable and available. Make sure that products that are targeting the mainstream market have enough VRAM and capabilities for those players. Because you look over the past couple of generations, the mid-range of the mainstream has been really lackluster. Lots of products with problem A, problem B. So those are where the opportunities, I think, lie. Sort of convincing gamers that the mainstream market is something that's being taken care of. It's not just a second-class citizen. They're not just fully interested in the high-end market, which does make money, but still, there's a big market for good mainstream GPUs. So that's the opportunity that I would see. And I think there's a huge opportunity there. It's a gaping hole. The B580 tried to fill it a little bit at the low end. It's a huge hole for that $200 to $400 market to create a really compelling, and we don't have to talk about like crazy new features or anything. It's just execute. It's the basics haven't even been executed. Price to performance ratio, enough VRAM so people can play at decent quality settings on the monitors that they have. It's just basic stuff. So that's the opportunity. And it's wide open this generation for a company like AMD to come in and create compelling products.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of mistakes I could say Intel's made, but I think the one that would come to mind for me is biting off more than they could chew in graphics. Like it's so glaringly obvious that at least Raja was hyping up that they are going to compete with the 4090, and like thinking that they could just be number one in one or arguably two generations is hilarious. Like all they had to do is make like one 12 gigabyte card with Alchemist, get it out on time when there's shortages. Instead, they tried to make some big lineup that came out really at the worst time something could come out, when the market was crashing. And then they just did it again as well. And I mean, that'd be the biggest fail, I'd say, for Intel. And then for AMD, I would say like how they bungled FSR 3. Like everyone was actually hoping AMD would catch up or be good enough a generation earlier than they ended up being. And it's AMD should be, and they're fine now. Now Sony's asking for AMD to help them with FSR 4, whatever. But the fact that it seemed like the PlayStation group made a better upscaling tech before AMD did is mind blowing. And AMD should have been ashamed of that. Of like, think of what Sony doesn't want to have to spend money on that, but like they're sitting there going, well, we're stuck with FSR. It's not as good. We should probably develop our own so that worst case scenario, we have something close to DLSS and we are not relying on AMD. The other fail I have, and I didn't prepare this ahead of time, I was just thinking, is the way Xbox handled Game Pass and not. I mean, I could do a whole episode on that, but I really thought that could be a winner, and I just cannot believe that they were surprised that people stopped buying Xboxes when they told people to not buy an Xbox for Starfield. I mean, wow.
Yeah, that's weird decision making happening over in the console market for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about like doing things just for gamers, and it comes down to like upscaling obviously was a big opportunity in the previous generation, because that's what gamers were clearly signaling in the market, that they were buying products for upscaling capabilities for DLSS and that sort of thing. So, Nvidia's making these big claims about like the future of rendering being AI based, and it's going to be generating all these sorts of things, neural rendering, whatever. Is that a big
Press
opportunity?
X for doubt. That's what I would say.
I don't know. Like, is that a big opportunity in the market? Maybe it's very much on them to prove that those technologies are ready for prime time, can do what they're claiming. Because as we've seen from things like frame generation, the marketing claims did not match the reality for that technology. And it's not even a bad technology or anything. It's just that the way it was marketed and what it was claimed to do is a very limited analysis of what the actual feature does. So I don't know. Maybe is AI features going to be popular for gaming in the future? Who knows? Is that an opportunity? Maybe, but I think that's not something gamers are necessarily asking for right now. Like, you're not seeing huge swathes of huge amounts of PC gamers going, you know what I want right now is like AI chatbots in my role playing game. Like,
Yeah.
they're just like, make a good game, thanks. Make the gameplay good. Make the graphics look nice, and I'll play it. No, like, sure, a game developer might be able to come out and produce some nice AI features that improve the gameplay and make it compelling, but people aren't specifically asking for, I'm not going to play that PC game unless it's got, AI is integrated to ChatGPT AI or whatever. Like, no one cares about that. It's about the gameplay and making games good. So I think an opportunity, if I was thinking of like what features and things could be improved for future gaming, obviously we're still seeing issues with traversal stutter and shader compilation in games, and it seems to be something that game engines that are the majority of games are being made on Unreal Engine at the moment. It's a huge engine, so it's very important that that runs well on modern GPUs. And so, is there something that can be done there to alleviate the issues that those engines are having with traversal stutter and shader compilation? Because even outside of like the in-game stuff, like waiting for shader compilation is very annoying. It takes a long time in some games. You have to wait around before you're playing it. You have to do it with every driver update or configuration change, which is annoying. Are those things that can be optimized in some sort of GPU thing? I think gamers would be, if you're presenting two things to gamers, do you want AI chatbots and AI interactions in games, or do you want traversal stutter and shader compilation to be improved?
Maybe that's what RDNA 5 could do, right? Maybe that could be the feature, is they worked and tried something in the pipeline where we're going to compile shaders 10 times faster, and we actually put an IP block in the graphics card to do that.
Yeah.
It just seems like a no-brainer now that I think about it.
Or majorly accelerating something like frame generation so that there's no longer that latency penalty. Because there's always that issue. There is overhead enabling frame generation, which kind of hurts. Like, it doesn't improve latency, but it also hurts latency. And frame generation would be a much better technology if there wasn't that cost to using it. If it was more like you turn on, there's not really a cost. It doesn't improve every aspect to gaming, but there's also no downsides. The issue with it right at the moment is there's always a trade-off. It does some things, but it also hurts other things. So if that can be majorly accelerated, then that's something that could make frame generation much more usable without the downsides. But those are things that we're talking about, the fixing traversal stutter, improving frame generation, that are much more difficult. Like, those are lots and lots of engineering hours to put into that. The gaming market doesn't even need stuff like that. There are so many low-hanging fruits that we were talking about, just the price to performance, VRAM, those sort of things, and that it's unbelievable that those things are not being harnessed by companies, not Nvidia, because again, they can just do whatever, but by AMD and Intel. It is, again, it's mind-blowing that the low-hanging fruit is not being, I don't know, picked by those companies. And that is just a huge opportunity. And yeah, I'm optimistic. I hope that those angles and things will be taken with upcoming products, because there's just, we could probably talk for hours about those opportunities because there's just so many of them.
Yeah, I agree. I think you could see a world where, again, I'm not saying this will happen, but hopefully it happens, where like Nvidia with the RTX 6000 series is like 8 times frame gen with only slightly more artifacts. Then AMD's like, we accelerate frame gen so there's less latency. We also have an IP block for compiling shaders instantly. We literally just added to the die the things you want. We didn't add all this AI stuff that's clearly not meant for gamers, but NVIDIA is trying to say it is, so that they can sell you an AI card that really wasn't meant for gaming. You could see that, like, and you could see the marketing right there. I mean, like, Radeon actually built for gaming. That sort of a thing. Yeah, I think that could be the type of thing where you combine that with a high-end product and you go, oh, yeah, this is the features the high end gamers actually want. And now maybe they'll give a 10900 XT a try or whatever they end up calling it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say like AI based gaming is not going to be some sort of future of gaming, because it might at some point. But the biggest issue with these things is just prove it. It's as simple as that. Nvidia has to prove that that's the case. And if AMD came out and they made let's say a shader compilation accelerator or something, I don't even know whether that would work. So this is just purely a hypothetical thing. Let's say they made that and they were advertising it. It's easily provable whether that works or not. You play games. Is there shader compilation stutter and long shader compilation times? Yes or no? Easily proven, right? So that is something where you would market it and it would either work or it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, you just probably wouldn't advertise it or include it. If it does work, great, right? With AI stuff, NVIDIA is trying to go down this path of advertising and claiming that these things are going to be the future well before they're actually ready. So it's all based on like hype and promises. A shader compilation block, there's no hype and promises there. It works or it doesn't, and instantly in that generation or not. With AI, again, like they're having to do all these, neural rendering's the future. This is the future. We've put in these features, and yeah, it's good that NVIDIA's invested in this because it's paid off for things like DLSS. The investment they made into AI capabilities with Turing is now starting to pay off for upscaling and those sorts of things with the transformer model for DLSS 4, for example, which 5 or 6 years later, great they made that investment. They're in a really good position for those sorts of things. But we're in a repeat of that for all the new AI features. You can claim that that's going to be important now, but how long are we waiting until that's the case? Is it important to buy GPUs now for that in the future? Can the GPUs available today actually do neural rendering for gaming when that becomes a feature in the next generation of games? Are they going to be fast enough? And so there's all those question marks. And so for me, with the AI gaming thing, it's as simple as if you want that to be the future, just prove it. We'll see what games can do with those sorts of things. We'll assess it at the time. But I'm certainly not going to be recommending GPUs to gamers right now based on the promise of AI gaming in the future. Because who knows where that's going to go and whether it's going to be as important and revolutionary as is being claimed at the moment.
Yeah, I guess as a final fun thing to point out, if I'm allowed to add one more fail by big corporations, it's nothing to do really with gaming. It's the Coca-Cola AI generated ad and the AI generated short films and them bragging. Did you know that we were able to generate this without hiring an actor or filming it? And it only took us 100,000 GPUs in 2 months, which probably cost more than just filming the goddamn ad.
Yeah, it looks like
And that
crap.
and it looks terrible. Those are the moments where I'm like, this looks like a bubble to me. This looks like some blockchain stuff where you're
Mhm.
just like, isn't this amazing? And you're like, do you guys not see that this costs more and it looks worse and you're bragging about it?
Yeah,
But
like
yeah, I think that
NVIDIA Ace is impressive as a technology. Like I've used the demo and the way that there is some interactivity there with the NPCs in the game via that sort of thing. It is impressive, and you can see how that could be integrated into a game into the future. It's just a matter of it's a tech demo right now, so you kind of have to prove that that is something that is going to be something that not just improves games, but something that game developers want. Like, are artists working on big role playing games, for example, do they want an AI to produce the answers from NPCs, or do they want their dialogue to be handcrafted so that each gamer gets the experience that they want to create as an artist? Whereas, some of those AI, small language models or whatever, they can produce such a wide variety of answers and wide variety of interactivity that maybe game developers are not as interested in integrating a feature like that because they want to create more of a bespoke experience where every element of it is crafted in the way that they want to craft it. So even if a tool is available, it's not necessarily the case where a game developer will use that tool. And I mean, again, that's one side of things. The other side of things is obviously all the neural rendering. You can turn algorithms into graphics via AI and all that sort of thing. That seems like that's got a long way to go to becoming the technology that NVIDIA is claiming that it will be. So we'll see how that goes. But lots of questions to answer there. And certainly I would not be buying current or next generation products based on that if games are not necessarily using that. Because we're not even in an era where ray tracing is dominant yet, and that was advertised as a feature 6 years ago. So I would imagine for AI neural rendering, it'll be even more difficult to sell that to the gaming crowd than we've seen for things like ray tracing.
Yeah, it's funny. I got to wrap up soon, but now you mentioned this chat thing. Another example of the AI hype that, in my opinion, is a glaring example of how this isn't good when they're like, oh, there's that cyberpunk looking bar thing they showed off where someone walks in and they're like, and look, and now they're walking back in again on a new playthrough, and the bartender says an entirely different thing. I'm like, that means that this AI has no personality. Like, I think if my girlfriend could predict maybe what I would say to most people when they walk into a bar, and I might sound more robotic because I make the same jokes, or my dad makes the same jokes. The dad joke, at a restaurant where my dad, every time if he's eaten everything, he says to the waiter, "Oh, we hated it. Look, the plate's empty." It's like, yeah, that's kind of like a robot that my dad always makes that joke, but that's because that's his personality. And if the AI is talking to you a different way every time you talk to them, how can you even make a video game that works? Because that's not how people act.
Yeah, I'm sure that technology will improve to the point where it can have personalities and be more confined. But yeah, obviously the early demos that wasn't as much the case, or it can end up being that, I sort of described AI in the past as having sort of this like simpleton vibe, where a lot of the output that's generated is like, it just has the way that it's written, the way that it's presented is like you're just speaking to a simpleton. Like, it's not very complicated. It doesn't have a lot of personality to it. It's very generic. And that's obviously not going to work in games where you need characters that are vibrant and interesting, because every character in a game being bland and generic is not a compelling game. It's a bad game.
But Tim, now there's millions of them you can talk to, and they're all bland. Isn't that better than 20 that were good?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure at some point they'll get personality. They'll solve that. It's always a thing that, current demos are never the end product for those sorts of things. But at least for me, like, I feel like a feature like ray tracing is kind of easier to sell to gamers. You can show gamers an improvement that's made from ray tracing. You can show them a ray traced image, compare it to a non-ray traced image, even if it's not feasible to create that image in real time on current hardware. You can show them and be like, look how good this looks. And people can be like, I agree, that looks really good. If modern games can look like that, amazing. How do you sell neural rendering to someone? Like, your game will look the same, but instead of being rendered by traditional methods, it'll be rendered in a different way that's faster and more efficient, but the end product is the same. Like, how do you sell that to someone? It's very, very...
It kind of feels like a Rube Goldberg machine of getting to the same result.
Yeah, it's like, okay, so it does the output in a different way, but better, and maybe runs a bit faster. Like, again, that's going to be a real challenge to sort of, it's not going to be as, and even ray tracing has been difficult. Like, the A to B on ray tracing, a lot of people say they don't see the difference, can't tell, don't games already look great, performance is obviously a concern. So if that, which has some things you can point to and show real comparisons, A versus B, and try and make these points, how's that going to go for more black box behind the scenes GPU stuff? And then obviously with that more front-facing AI features in games, there's all the issues that you were talking about with how do you convince people that, a game built with AI isn't just AI slop? Because many people think that a lot of AI output at the moment is slop or very close to slop, especially when it comes to generating genuine, enjoyable video content or gaming content or art, quote unquote. I'm not big into art or anything. I'm not a huge, let's look at the artistic vision of this and that. Like, cool, but for gamers, you've just got to convince people that you're not creating just garbage. And let's be honest, right? A lot of games come out that are not made with AI that are garbage. So how do you convince gamers that, like, something that is known to be sloppy and produce poor quality output is going to make games better when people can't even make them good based on current traditional techniques? Of course, that's just a very generic statement, right? There are plenty of really well-crafted, fantastic games. Just been playing Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Fantastic game, really well crafted. So it's not every game, but certainly there are games where gamers have complained about the quality, the polish, the lack of, interesting characters, very boring, bland sort of gameplay, that sort of thing. So if they can do that without AI, what's AI going to do?
Yeah, like you could almost say like AI slot factories may have been useful in like the PS2 era where there were only so many games you could play. Honestly, before that, there were already too many shovelware games. But now the issue, yeah, something I keep coming to. The issue is not that we don't have enough content, actually. The issue is that
Yes,
we
yeah.
want it to be higher quality. So AI seems to be creating a problem it will then need to solve again, not solving any problem we actually have right now.
Yeah, we don't need AI to make the 10 fetch quests that you were putting into Assassin's Creed now 100 fetch quests. You want side quests and side content and main content to be really compelling, really well put together stories, which just doesn't seem to be something that AI can do at the moment. And maybe AI will just be a tool that game developers use
Mhm.
for certain aspects and just not the majority of the creative workflow. That's probably what's going to happen. You'll see, some aspects to games be AI generated because that was the best way of doing it. Similar to any sort of tool that you would see from Photoshop or whatever, you can remove someone from a photo the easiest way by using the latest generation of the features in Photoshop. So that's a tool. It's not generative AI necessarily, not generating a whole fresh new image for you. It's just using it as part of a tool that becomes part of the game development process. I'm sure that'll happen. But again, it's all things that have to be proven, have to be sold, have to be marketed to people in a way that makes people feel like they want those features. Things like G Assist, the latest thing that requires a 12 gig GPU. When I was demonstrating this feature, I'm like, why would I use this? Like, I don't need to type in something to change settings for me on the fly. I can just change the settings myself. I'm not an idiot. Like, it takes me all of 5 seconds to change settings in games. Like,
It's like a lot of modern cars. Uh, oh, well, now you can just go into this giant tablet and go through 5 menus to turn the temperature up or down. It's like, I'm pretty sure the dial worked in the 50s, guys. I
yeah,
don't think I need to go through a tablet menu that can crash instead of pressing a button.
yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, on that note, I think that's a good one to end on. So I want to thank you again, Tim, for coming on the podcast yet again. Please tell everybody where they can find you.
Well, I'm sure most people know about the Hardware Unboxed main channel. So that's obviously a place for everyone. We have our podcast as well, the Hardware Unboxed podcast. You want to hear, it's mostly Steve and I just chatting about stuff on a weekly basis, whatever the hot topics are, feedback from reviews, that sort of thing is in our podcast. And then, we've got the Monitors channel as well if you want to check out our monitor content. Didn't even really chat about monitors today, mostly just the GPU stuff. But, that's the way of the market at the moment. Everything is about the GPUs.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I can tell. Like, big Zen 6 thing, and it's like, ooh, hopefully this is a slow burn that gets above 100,000, and then GPU idea, boom, like hundreds of thousands of views. But that is the market right now. Well, we'll certainly be happy to have you on again, talk about monitors, and I'll have links in the description to those 2 channels as well. And otherwise, I'll just plug my own stuff. Make sure you're subscribed. Make to Moore's Law Z on YouTube. Make sure you ring the bell button. Make sure you subscribe to Broken Silicon on your podcast app of choice. Give us a review. Check out our Patreon. I know Hardware Unboxed also has a Patreon you should check out as well. And then, yeah, like, share. That all helps. Comment below. And have a good week, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carmen Cry and Carrie Nosugad as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the About/Support page in the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Carrie Nosugada as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and Jean-Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans, much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guest questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, if you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family and on social media and websites like Reddit. And give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels: Brad Medlin, Drita Full, Z Jits, Daniel D, Deke, Nicholas Buckner, Aaron Close, Jan Rauner, Daniel Hyde, MJB1, GZ Ziggy, Toka, SNES Chalmers, Jem Ferrier, Velka Malev, Jensen Wang, Gregor Sacker, Sarcastros, Chris Trish, Evan Dingle, Compressed AI Blocks, Hal Booma, Shredbird, Sammy Wallace, Jordan Simkovic, The Boss Haas, Chrysantine, Jonathan, Jake Dude 23, Neithra Zing, Jake Martin, Zlicky, Mead and Pork, Tim Robb, Ian Clifford, Travis Gooding, Gamers Unite, Mad, Zoot Suit Taylor, Greg, Michael McGee, Patty Cake, Stephen Coates, Amiable Chief, Mark Mitchell, Tommy, Aisha, James Anderson, Mark Raidmaker, Cole Addick, Cameron, Henry Zhang, Wesley Sager, Michelle Pell, Mai Sharona, Hexapuma, Winwing, Reginald Ari, Teak Autumn, Windstar, Corey Leonard, James I, Raider, Little Germany, Shay, Milton, Melodic Warrior, Brett Jones, Chuck Glidden, Mac Daffy, Stephen Dick, Justin Bussell, Austin Haggerty, Joe Foot, Brian Scanlon, Hardland, Jansen Angima, Joseph Kelly, Slushpaw, Him Segung, Tails 2299, Jeffrey Gentleman, Sisyphos 7771, Brian Wright, The Forbidden Juice, RB Racer, Alex Vega, Dr. J Mad, Free D, Michael Cozy, John Swin, Crystal Joe Albergum, Kikom, Solarize 80, Thalo 215, Sprutnik, Brian P, Hudat 42, Cornster 671, Penta Winta, Hal, Richard, Omega Doge, John Wick Boomstick, Mr. Tiger, Penguins Love AI, Hugo, Ender Kiwi, Porcelain Oats, Curry King 3, Nick Mania, State Farm Steak Sakosha 37 by 73, Sheriff Lotfi, Rye Hill Cheap Bowls, Kevin Kuntz, Smash Axley, Armand Vacatura, Callan Reichel, Jonathan Harris, and Angel of Cake, and of course, thank you to Sarah for the music.